in the luxurious office of the director of the restaurant. In the place where the subordinates were usually located sat a man in his 50s. Since there was a tense silence in the room, one could assume that the upcoming conversation was quite serious. Little did he know that Philip Miller was anxiously awaiting the decision of his boss, James Harrison. Working as the manager of this fine establishment, he found himself in a situation where he urgently needed someone's help. When on earth is he walking around? I've been sitting in this office for the past hour like a lost man, probably admiring his restaurant again, Philip thought with irritation. At the same moment, the door opened and James Harrison entered the room. He was a tall, trim man with a kind but overly pale face and a strong-willed chin. His shrewd gaze slid over Philip's face, unmistakably recognizing the uneasiness that plagued his employee's soul. "Shall we get to the heart of the matter, Philip? What is the reason for your desire to meet?" James Harrison said, sitting down in a leather armchair. "I hope your daughter Emily is all right." "Yes, of course she's fine," he answered hastily, feeling his heart pounding in his chest. It was hard to get to the point, though it should be easier for him since he was the manager of the restaurant. "That's good to hear," James Harrison said. "I've always sympathized with Emily. She's a lovely, sweet girl." Philip swallowed convulsively at this compliment to his daughter and looked at his boss with a hunted look. At the same moment, he realized the inevitable. James Harrison was his only chance to get out of debt, and that was to marry his daughter off to this rich man. But how do you get the boss to make that decision? To make it go smoothly? The tension in the room became so palpable that it felt like skates could be molded into the air. Philip visibly tensed, struggling to find the words that could convince his boss to agree to his proposal. "I realize this may sound sudden, but I'm in a very difficult situation," he began, his voice trembling with excitement. "What kind of trouble are you in, Philip? Am I not paying you enough? It seems to me that your salary is more than serious," the businessman said in surprise. Philip coughed embarrassedly. "Well, you see, I've got debts that I just can't pay off on my own." James Harrison frowned. A serious expression appeared on his face. He squinted at the manager, waiting for further explanation. The next words came with great difficulty to Philip. "You see, James, you probably know I've been looking for a suitor for my daughter for a long time. And Emily is sure to make a fine wife to whoever chooses her." James Harrison looked at his subordinate with bewilderment. "I do not understand what you're getting at, Philip. Do you need money for the wedding?" Then asked directly, "Why these curtsies?" But Philip was silent. His mind raced in search of a reasonable explanation. At last, catching on to one of the words he thought promising, he came to the main point. "James, the fact is, I would like to marry my daughter Emily to you." Sweat beaded on his forehead, and his hand involuntarily reached around his neck to loosen the knot of his tie. In truth, he'd never thought of Emily romantically, seeing her solely as the daughter of his manager, and here he was being offered to marry a girl about to become his stepdaughter. "Philip, I appreciate your confidence, but I don't think it's the best idea," he said cautiously. "Emily is a wonderful girl, but I don't think she's ever considered me for a fiancé." Philip's eyes twinkled with a sly twinkle. "James, it's the only way out for me. Emily won't mind, and Jessica doesn't think so either. And I'll be eternally grateful to you if you do." "Does Jessica really think so too? Why didn't she ever tell me that?" James Harrison exclaimed, and then his lips pressed into a thin line. Of course, the businessman understood the situation in which his subordinate found himself, along with his wife, who worked in the same restaurant as a cook's assistant. Truth be told, the thought of a marriage of convenience brought James no pleasure. "Easy. James Harrison, this is a touchy subject. I can't make a decision right away," he said. "I need time to think it over, to calculate all the risks." Philip looked pleadingly at his boss and tried to grasp every opportunity. "Please, James Harrison, give me a chance to make things right. My daughter Emily doesn't deserve the kind of life I've given her." James Harrison shook his head. The businessman then rose from his chair and walked to the window that offered a panoramic view of the city. On his haggard, pale face, there was an expression of deep thoughtfulness. He was trying to make a difficult decision. "Well, Philip, I promised to think it over carefully, and I'll let you know my decision as soon as possible," he said, turning to the manager. Philip respectfully extended his hand to the restaurant owner. "Thank you for your understanding. I look forward to hearing from you," he said with relief. James Harrison nodded and shook the manager's hand firmly. Philip left the office with a heavy heart. The fate of his adopted daughter Emily and his own future now depended on the decision of the superintendent. Deep down, Philip felt that the boss would take the bait. After all, Rose was right. She had calculated everything subtly, immediately realized how to catch this rich man. They've been together for a year for a reason. Wife Jessica's a sucker. All her romantic dreams of love are ridiculous. No fool is a fool. Philip left his boss's office and immediately called Rose. "Hi, it's me. Did you talk to him and tell him what you told me?" "Of course I did, Philip. He was drooling at the thought of my Emily. Men are like that. But here's the thing about the hat instead of the dowry. Let James pay off our debts, and then we'll be on our way." Rose smiled. They talked for a while. Then they went about their business. Philip took control of the restaurant, and Rose watched another TV show. At the same time, Philip's wife Jessica was helping the chef Michael Thompson in the kitchen as if nothing had happened. It was rumored that he was friends with the owner himself and often visited him. "James has been a little down lately," the chef said casually. Jessica dropped her knife in surprise. "What do you mean, down?" "I think he's fine, but he's a little thin, of course. A little blush would be nice." "Why is it so bad?" Jessica asked anxiously. Vance to Thompson's side sighed. "It's bad, Jessica, and it's bad. They found a disease, but one that would break your tongue to pronounce. The prognosis is dire. They say James is ready to write his will." "Way, will?" Jessica was surprised. "But as far as I know, he's alone. No relatives." That chef chuckled. "That's what I'm talking about. James called a notary recently to prepare the necessary documents. He says I'll make a will in favor of the woman who agrees to marry me. What's he thinking? He's got half the town after him now. It's not right." "What about love? Feelings?" Jessica marveled. Michael Thompson frowned, tasting the dish he had prepared. "Well, when you've got 6 months to live, it's not that big of a deal. James wants to die in the arms of some pretty girl. Well, I'm exaggerating, of course, but that's the gist of it. Who else would he leave his money to?" Jessica coughed, embarrassed. "Orphanages, for example, or social funds." Michael Thompson waved his hand. "No way, they'll steal it. You need to keep an eye on the money." "And who's going to do it?" "That's right. And so you see, and we'll still fall in love. Although, of course, the case is complicated. It's not easy to understand the true motives, but I'm not interested in any of that. I've known him since high school. We played hockey. I was a forward. He was a forward. Oh, how long ago was that?" Jessica nodded sympathetically, not even realizing that at that very moment her husband Philip was discussing the marriage of Emily and James Harrison. Time stretched like rubber, showing Philip eternity. Every phone call, every sound of footsteps behind him made his heart beat with furious force. To his only wife, Jessica, he said nothing. Only to his mistress, who had actually devised this cunning plan. Finally, close to lunchtime, the phone rang in his jacket pocket. Philip took the call with a trembling hand, realizing that it could fundamentally change his life. The caller was James Harrison, who again invited him to his office. Philip now went to his boss on his feet, trying not to notice the nasty shiver that ran down his back. This time, the chief met his subordinate with a serious, but at the same time not without sympathy look. "Philip, I've made a decision," he said with a dry official tone. I agree to take Jessica and your daughter, Emily. In doing so, I agree to pay off all your debts to creditors." Philip was so stunned that he couldn't even hold back the tears of relief, which of course were fake publicity. At the same moment, he hugged the businessman, replying with equally warm feelings. "Thank you, James Harrison. Thank you for saving me and my daughter from disgrace. And thank you for giving me a chance," the manager whispered, resting his face against his shoulder. The business boss felt the responsibility he had taken on and promised he would never regret the decision. "I will take care of Emily as if she were my own daughter. You can rest assured of that." Philip nodded demurely and began to discuss the details with the chief. In a confidential conversation, they set the day of the wedding, which was to take place in a week's time. James Harrison, horrified at the sight, was not in the least embarrassed by this haste. Philip, on the other hand, was over the moon. After all, he would not only get rid of debts, but also provide his adopted daughter a bright future. True, first of all, he thought, of course, about his own benefit, and everything else was a matter of tenth. And if Jessica and Emily knew what lay ahead of them, the first to know was the wife. It was in the evening when Jessica returned from work later than her husband, who, as the manager, was in fact her boss. By this time, the atmosphere in the house was already tense, which at any moment could erupt in anger and resentment. Jessica stood in the living room with her purse on the floor, her hands shaking and her eyes burning with tears. Opposite her, her husband was seated comfortably in an armchair by the blazing fireplace. The cold, calculating expression on Philip's face contrasted perfectly with the shock in his wife's eyes. "How could you?" Jessica blurted out from the doorway. At the same moment, her voice broke into a scream. "How could you sell our daughter for debt? Have you nothing sacred left?" Wide smiles. "You know, it's not really a sale, more like a lucrative contract, if you will. I'm just securing our family's future and nothing more. James Harrison is a wealthy man, and being related to him will save us from financial problems in the future. And not just us, but Emily herself, and even her children." "Have you thought about the shame?" Jessica spluttered. "You're giving our daughter away to a man twice her age. What will people think of us? How am I supposed to face the restaurant staff if I become the mother-in-law of the owner?" "James Harrison is a respected man in the community," Philip said reasonably, "and he looks quite lively for his age. How much do you understand? Feelings are not bought with money. Certainly not love," Jessica retorted. "And how could you set our daughter up like that? She's a young, beautiful girl. Yes, she deserves much more than to be a pawn in your financial scams." After his wife's words, Philip instinctively looked around, although he knew perfectly well that Emily was still at work. A nurse in therapy sounds proud. 24 hours a day at work and not much profit. But now that she was gone, Philip decided to continue the awkward conversation. "This isn't about toys, Jessica," he exclaimed angrily. "This is a matter of life and death. And first and foremost for you, dearie, we're on the verge of ruin. And James Harrison is our only chance to save ourselves. And if this wedding falls through, you won't have a job at the restaurant. Worst case scenario, you'll be selling pies at the bus stop." Tears welled up in Jessica's eyes. "Do you think it's okay that our salvation should depend on our daughter's marital status? Does Emily deserve to be married like that?" "Didn't she?" Philip objected. "She deserves the opportunity to secure a secure future for herself and her future children. And what do you suggest? Bend over backwards for the rest of her life in this department. With James Harrison, she'll be living like Christ, holding a fortune in her hands," Philip said confidently. "No, what are you talking about? Our daughter deserves to be loved." "Philip, but why should she have his money when James Harrison is seriously ill?" Jessica insisted. "She doesn't need wealth. She needs real feelings." Sick. That's a good one. "I didn't know that," Philip said in surprise. "Then she'll be an heiress sooner, won't she?" "She'll be rewarded with your love," Jessica said bitterly. "Nonsense. a fiction, a luxury we can't afford now. But money is something else, Philip replied without blinking an eye. And you want to solve your problems at the expense of your daughter? Maybe you better start moving yourself. Jessica exclaimed, choking back tears. Peace ends. Of course. How could I not? Especially since she's not my own daughter, and neither are you. So there's no need to appeal to my fatherly feelings. But James said it's her destiny, period. You and I owe it to her to make her happy, Philip said in one breath. Jessica covered her face with her hands and sobbed. Destiny? What do you know about it? We're going to ruin her life, you know, and Emily is my own daughter. So what if I took her from an orphanage? It's not the mother who gave birth. It's the mother who raised her. Philip's cheeks are flushed with anger. My mother is an orphanage, the daughter of an alcoholic. Are you out of your mind? Yes, I agreed to the custody arrangement and took care of her all this time. I'm still taking care of her now. You hear me? And if you get it in the way, I will tell Emily the truth. You don't want that, do you? So calm down, Jessica. Think about your family and use your judgment. It's just the way it is. You don't want to stand up on the street, do you? Jessica slumped her shoulders, shaken by her sobs, her heart breaking with worry for her daughter's future. She knew Philip was right, and though their family was on the brink of ruin, James Harrison couldn't be their only hope, not at this price. No, not at the cost of their only daughter's fate. No, I can't do it, Philip, she whispered. I can't sell my daughter. I'd rather be on the street, but not this. Philip smiled smugly, then took the poker and began to stir the embers in the fireplace, making sparks fly in all directions. You've already done it, he said, calming down a little. Yes, Jessica, you've already sold your daughter. From the moment James and I signed the prenup papers. Jessica looked up at her husband in surprise. Her eyes were full of pain and despair. What prenup? What are you talking about? We can still back out. We could apologize to James Harrison. He'll understand, won't he? With a sneer. Philip interjected. Yes, he'd destroy us if he knew we'd changed our minds. He already treats us with contempt, treats us like servants. Fetch, serve, and get out of his sight. Don't think he'll forgive us for this. Jessica recoiled from her husband. At that moment, her heart almost burst with pain. Truth be told, she still couldn't believe that Philip was so easily willing to sacrifice his daughter's happiness for his own gain. You monster, Jessica shouted. Do you hear me? I hate you. Philip gave her a scornful look, but did not reply. He simply got up from his chair and walked out of the living room. Jessica still stood there, unable to take a step, her whole body trembling. She knew that her husband would never change his mind. That meant Emily was doomed. While Jessica and Philip were discussing their relationship, James Harrison was sitting in his office watching the fish swimming in the aquarium. The businessman was not feeling well. Painkillers practically did not help, so he felt a strong decline in strength. In his head were born thoughts of how to burn a profitable alliance with Emily. God, marrying Philip's daughter. What if it didn't work out, but he was on the verge of bankruptcy? It would be an ingenious move on Philip's part to get him out of financial trouble. James cringed at the thought of it. At 49, he already felt like a real old man. And then there was this disease. It had aged him in a matter of months. Did he need this wedding? A difficult question, and one he didn't know the answer to. He also doubted Emily's motives. Would she truly love him, or would she be just an obedient tool in her father's hands? The thought of a marriage based on mutual gain was unpleasant to him. In truth, he wanted true love, the union of two hearts. Besides, a marriage with Emily could ruin his reputation, because people will surely whisper that he is a cold-blooded, calculating rich man, ready to do anything to satisfy his own ego. Emily is beautiful, of course, but is she intelligent, kind, sensual? They've barely spoken to each other. What if she doesn't like me? Looking at his own reflection in the mirror, James whispered. When's the businessman's doubts increased when he realized he was overestimating the importance of the union. After all, most marriages of convenience last for years. What's easier for everyone? One pays, the other bathes in luxury. You mean, nothing complicated. The usual scheme of human exchange based on the sale of feelings. It's all right. But James wanted to feel truly loved, desired, not just a tool in someone else's hands. Not an easy decision, but you have to weigh it carefully. And he had to be honest with himself, with Philip and Jessica. But maybe there's another way that doesn't require sacrifice. Maybe I could find a way to help Philip without marrying his daughter, James asked himself again, wiping the mirror with the palm of his hand. Little did he know that this was what he had been doing for the past few years, without any close friends. James Harrison was talking to himself, as if he were talking to his twin brother on the other side of the mirror. Sighing sadly, the businessman stood up and walked to the window. The city, too, had been swallowed up by twilight. The lights of lanterns and signs pierced the darkness like the identifying lights of ships heading toward a strong beacon. For a moment, James felt so alone that he wanted to howl with longing, and yet there were so many people hanging around. But James needed someone who could understand and share the last days of his life with him. Maybe even give him a glass of water or gently cover his eyelids when he was gone. Or maybe even weep at his grave and bring him a bouquet on his anniversary. Dreams. James knew that Philip's daughter was beautiful. But was that all that mattered? Would they be able to create something truly worthwhile together? Realizing that he couldn't make a final decision, James decided to talk to Emily in person. To do this, he was going to call her to his restaurant tomorrow to observe her manners and words. Perhaps it was then that the businessman would be able to understand whether they had a future together. And if not, well, we will have to accept that not all problems can be solved with the help of money, although he will still fulfill his obligations to Philip. After all, James considered himself a man of his word and was not going to break it, even in the face of his own death. How long did Dr. Thompson give him? A month? 3? Could he be lucky enough to last 6 months? Unsure of his theory, the businessman decided to call Emily the next morning, since he knew for a fact that tomorrow was her day off. Probably in this whole amazing story, Emily was the only one who didn't know until the last what was going on around her and what her parents and the businessman were up to. In the life of a young nurse, Emily also changed, and the kind that if her father found out about it, he would definitely go into hysterics, sputtering saliva and stomping his feet. It all began a little over a week ago. That morning, the rays of dawn were barely breaking through the blinds as Emily, a nurse on the therapy ward, prepared to turn in for her shift. But she was in for a bitter disappointment as the shift nurse, Felipe, had not shown up for work. Well, once again, the superintendent called her into the office. Emily thought bitterly. She, in turn, had spent a sleepless night tormented by doubts and fears. As it happened, not only was her place as a nurse on the ward at stake, but also the life of a man who was on death's doorstep. It all started with the fact that, late in the evening, a man without documents was brought to them with signs of severe pneumonia. He was brought by a city cab driver who could not pass by, because this vagrant collapsed on the hood of his car while crossing the street. At first, I thought he was just trying to get money from me, set me up. But when I touched his forehead, I knew. He's got a high fever, the driver said as he pulled the unconscious guy into the squad room. Emily nodded and helped pull him into the corridor. The tramp's condition was clearly critical, and without treatment, he had no chance of recovery. Thanking the cab driver, Emily, at her own risk, decided to give him first aid. As she did so, she saw in the stranger's eyes a strength of spirit and will to live that was felt on a subconscious level. Despite the disapproval of her colleagues and the threats of the doctor on duty, Emily made the bold decision to go against all odds. At her discretion, she introduced additional procedures and stayed with the patient throughout the night, providing not only medical but also psychological support. The night dragged on for an agonizingly long time. "What's your name?" After checking the patient's temperature, Emily asked. The boy shuddered and then slowly opened his eyes. "Victor. My name is Victor," he whispered. "That's good. Rest until morning. There's still time. We'll see," Emily whispered. Victor's condition improved a little and then worsened again. Emily did not leave his bedside for a minute, watching his every breath and movement. She believed that despite all predictions, the tramp would make it through the morning. Her perseverance and dedication began to bear fruit. By the time of the first shift, Victor's breathing had become more even, and his temperature began to gradually drop. But when ward manager Robert Stevenson came to check on his progress, he was surprised and shocked by what had happened. "Emily, who is this guy? And what right do you have to treat him as you see fit? Why did you give him a private room? Aren't you taking on too much?" he asked defiantly. Emily shuddered and began to explain what had happened. Even though the patient was doing well, she was still in danger of being fired. But she didn't regret her decision. She had saved a man who no one had given a chance, and that was more important to her than her own career. "I've seen a lot of things, but this, why on earth would you bring him to the station? Did you know we're having a ministry inspection at the clinic today? You should at least listen to the doctor on duty. Well, call a cab and get out of here with your tramp," Robert Stevenson stated unequivocally and pointed at the door. At that moment, Victor opened his eyes and understood everything without words. Staggering, he got up from the bed, got dressed, and disconnected the drip. "Good boy, you got it right," the superintendent muttered. Emily shook her head contritely. What could she do? But she couldn't take the patient home with her. Her father would make a scene, and she didn't want that. She could treat the vagrant remotely, though, giving him injections at another place she'd only recently learned of in her unenviable position. It was the only right thing to do, and so it had to be done that way and no other. Victor, on the other hand, took it calmly. He did not push pity, and also did not become hysterical or beg to leave him in the hospital. He dressed silently and, nodding goodbye, walked toward the exit. Emily looked at the superintendent with a mute reproach in her eyes and, without saying goodbye, followed, supporting Victor by the shoulder. Emily led him hurriedly to the cab. The tramp's pale cheeks seemed whiter than snow in the sunlight, and his gray eyes expressed almost nothing that they should have. "Where are we going?" he wheezed in a weak voice. "Someplace safe. Some place where you'll be taken care of," Emily replied. Luckily, the cab stopped right by the side of the field. She carefully placed Philip in the back seat, then handed the driver a slip of paper with the address of an abandoned house on the outskirts of town that served as a shelter for the homeless. As the cab moved forward, the hustle and bustle of the city was replaced by abandoned industrial neighborhoods. The landscape of parks turned into weedy wastelands. Gleaming high-rises gave way to the dilapidated houses of the poorer neighborhoods. The cabbie drove in silence. He didn't want to start a conversation with the tramp, and this despite the fact that Philip behaved decently and looked almost nothing like a homeless man. Finally, the car stopped in front of a dilapidated two-story house. The brick facade of the building was cracked like an old man's face. The windows hadn't had glass in 10 years, if not more. A sign that read "House of Mercy" hung from the moldering wooden doors. Emily carefully opened the door and helped Philip out of the car. The cool spring air finally knocked the heat from his exhausted body. After paying the cab driver, Emily and Philip entered the dimly lit hallways that smelled of dampness and disinfectant solution. At the same time, a slouching figure in a white coat advanced toward them. Emily recognized her. It was Rose, a nurse who had been in the same group at medical school. They had chosen very different jobs. Emily became a nurse in the therapy department, and Rose became a nurse in a shelter for the homeless and destitute. Together they took Philip to a tiny room where they laid him on an old, creaking bed. A small window barely let in the dim light, highlighting the dusty ceilings and shabby walls. Philip's body began to shake again. Rose took out a thermometer and put it to the Trump's chest. The man's heart was racing as if he had just run a 100-meter race for time. He has severe pneumonia, Emily explained. Had dreaded glum. He needs antibiotics and oxygen. Rose nodded and fetched a small first aid kit and vials of medicine from the cabinet. With confident movements, she injected the antibiotic into Philip's vein and put the oxygen mask on his face. The trembling in the patient's body gradually subsided as the medicine began to flow through the IV into his body. Emily stood a little to the side and watched Rose care for the patient with mixed feelings of gratitude and sadness. She knew he wouldn't have lived a day without their help. "How did he end up on the street?" Rose asked. "It's hard to say," Emily sighed. "He doesn't say much. I met him a few hours ago. I wanted to leave him at the station, but they wouldn't let me." Rose nodded in agreement. She'd seen enough street people in her life to know that each of them had a complicated history. Philip, on the other hand, was just another poor wretch in a long line of people left behind by a ruthless society. "I'll take care of him," Rose said. "Until he feels better, he'll stay here." "Thank you, Rose. I won't forget your help." Emily said goodbye and went outside. Then she hailed a cab again and asked the driver to take her home. All the way home she thought of Philip, forgotten by everyone, but given a second chance at life. The next day Emily returned to Mercy House with hot soup, a plate and a spoon. She found Philip lying in bed with a tattered book in his hands. His breathing was hoarse, and his face was covered with a crimson blush. His eyes were sunken and his lips were pressed into a thin line. Emily gently fed Philip some soup and offered him a bath, to which he shook his head negatively. The nurse smiled and sat silently by his side, holding his hand. It went on like this for about a week. Emily visited Philip, and together they talked in hushed tones about everything. Of course, because of her work, Emily couldn't spend too much time at Mercy House. But despite this, she still tried to visit the patient almost every day. Naturally, she kept it all a secret from her parents, especially from her father, who lately had been thinking of marrying her off well. Her mother, on the other hand, did not rush her daughter with her choice, wanting to keep her by her side longer. Emily was also well aware of the fact that she was adopted and found out about it quite by accident, when, as a high school student, decided to do a general cleaning of the house. In the absence of her parents, everything came out of the blue when a folder of custody papers fell into her hands from the top shelf of her closet. I wondered, who were her real parents? Were they rich or poor? Did they have any other children? Or was she the first one they decided to get rid of? She didn't know the answer to these questions. However, in order not to upset her, her mother decided to hide the truth about those very documents from her. Let it be so. Why upset the person who loves you more than life itself? That's what Emily thought as she walked home from work one more time. She had no idea what her father had in store for her when he saw her daughter leave. Philip decided to come in from afar. First he asked how work was and if she was doing well. Then he got to the point by saying that his boss, James Harrison, wanted to see her tomorrow. Emily's amazement knew no bounds to see me. Why should he? I'm nothing to him. The daughter of a restaurant manager, but James Harrison probably knows better, Philip said with pressure and looked meaningfully at his wife. Jessica sighed sadly and turned away from the window. Her husband had deftly played on her pain point, making her fear that her daughter might learn the truth about her past. What could she do? Talk her out of it and not go? But that wouldn't do anything, would it? Philip had already taken money from James, and not only had he taken it, but he'd already given it to his creditors. Of course, Jessica was bitter about what was happening. Her only hope was that her daughter would resent it and not go through with the deal. But she would have to come to that decision on her own to understand, to feel the whole situation. If only Jessica could have known that at that very moment, Emily was only concerned about one thing: the health of Ben's little brother, who was slowly, perhaps, on the mend. The next morning, So as not to upset Daddy, Emily went to meet James Harrison at the restaurant. By this time, the office of the businessman and creditor was literally saturated with an atmosphere of anxious expectation. Huge windows overlooking the city that lived its life gave the illusion of boundless power and authority. Behind the massive walnut desk sat James Harrison himself. The businessman's shrewd gaze, hidden behind his fine-rimmed glasses, was like an X-ray scanning those who dared to cross the threshold of his office. Today James wore an austere, dark blue suit that accentuated his lean figure and commanded the respect of those who had acquired a patriarchal paunch by this age. Emily knocked on the door before stepping over the threshold and timidly asking, "May I, James Harrison?" The businessman nodded as if the guest were his companion, not the daughter of a subordinate, anticipating a difficult conversation. The girl's heart raced and her hands became moist, as if before the most important exam of her life. A plain dress and low-heeled shoes made her look modest, a person who knew the value of money. The bright blush on her cheeks was evidence of the nervous tension she was trying to hide under a mask of ostentatious calm. Emily's appearance caught James Harrison's attention. A slight smile lit up his lips as he leaned back in his chair, assessing his visitor. The appearance was flawless. Her delicate features, large expressive eyes, and light chestnut-colored hair could drive anyone crazy, except that James himself wasn't going to go crazy. Not at all. In fact, under the guise of a bride, he was buying himself a daughter for an indefinite period of time, whose beautiful face would be the last thing he would see on this sinful earth. Well, in the meantime, let everyone think I'm a lusty rich man who has decided to gratify his ego in the face of his imminent demise. "Have a seat, Emily," he said in a low, measured voice. His cold tone left no doubt that the conversation was. Emily sank awkwardly to the edge of the chair, her skinny hands clenched into fists under the table. Of course, she couldn't ignore the hardness of James Harrison's gaze, which seemed to penetrate the most secret corners of her soul. "I don't know what to say." She immediately gave the initiative to the master of the office. "I know your father's in dire straits," James Harrison began, crossing his fingers in a lock on the newly flat surface of the desk. "However, I'm sure I can help him with his debts. I hope Philip has warned you about that." The businessman's words had an icy shower effect on Emily. The surprise took her breath away, and tears came to her eyes. "But my daddy didn't tell me anything about the debts," she whispered in a voice shaking with despair. "Okay, I didn't really doubt that. Surely Philip must have dumped that part of the case on me." James Harrison stretched out disappointedly. "And after all, his personal business has gone bust and he won't be able to repay the loan without my help. But don't get me wrong. It's not like I'm a charitable organization. I have obligations too." Emily felt that the businessman was leading her to something important, something that would change her life completely and irrevocably. For better or for worse. "I'm sorry, I don't understand what this is about," Emily asked timidly. James Harrison sighed sadly, displaying a complete semblance of compassion. "Believe me, I'm really, really sorry, Emily. I understand this is a difficult time, and your father was doing the best he could. Except we're talking about a considerable amount of money," he said. "And even if I were to agree to be a guarantor to reimburse the creditors, I'm not sure your father would be able to handle the payments." "Please give my dad a chance," Emily pleaded, and her eyes immediately filled with tears. "I won't let you down. Would you like me to work for you for free on the weekends? Or write promissory notes in my name? Just save me." The young girl's tears involuntarily broke James Harrison's restraint, forcing him to relive some of the less pleasant moments in his life. And after all, he hadn't gotten to the most important part yet, but how to tell this innocent-eyed girl what he was really up to. Where to get the nerve not to burn with shame? Thinking about it, James looked away, unable to withstand the direct and emotional appeal. There was silence in the office for a while, broken only by the ticking of the wall clock. Finally, James Harrison looked at Emily again. For the first time since their meeting, something resembling understanding flashed in the businessman's eyes. "All right, Emily," he said, pronouncing her name slowly, as if hearing it for the first time. "I'm willing to give your father a chance, but you must realize that if you don't fulfill your obligations to me, your father will be in serious trouble." Hope shone in Emily's eyes, and the tears and sadness on her face were replaced by a wide smile. "Thank you," she uttered with relief. "I won't let you down. Don't even doubt it. And what do I need to do for you to get your father's debt paid?" James Harrison turned pale, realizing that the moment of truth had arrived. Here he would gather air in his chest and say what Philip could not say. "Just don't drift," the man mentally told himself. Finally, realizing there was no turning back, he said in a choked voice, "You must be my wife, Emily." Emily flinched and pressed her back against the back of the chair. "A wife? But we have such an age difference. How is that even possible?" James got up from the table and started pacing around the room like a man on a roll. At this point, he was ready to fall through the ground in shame. Why had he said that? Why had he gone along with Philip? The businessman's condition suddenly worsened dramatically, causing him to nearly collapse from the extreme pain in his chest. "Are you feeling ill?" Emily shouted as she saw the businessman slumped on his side, clinging to the edge of the table with his fingers. No, it will pass surely. Now, just a little more. The pills are in my jacket pocket," James whispered, losing consciousness. Even though Emily was a nurse, this was hardly the first time she had encountered something like this. "I'm going to call an ambulance now," she exclaimed through tears. When Emily reached for the phone at the foot of the businessman's desk, she saw the man writhing on the floor with his hands around his throat. Oh my God, he had a laryngeal injury. She quickly dialed the ambulance number and whispered to the dispatcher, explained the situation in a nutshell. The dispatcher replied, "You see, there's been a serious accident downtown. A truck has skidded at speed and it has demolished several cars. We don't have any crews available right now." "Say, you're a medical professional, right?" "Right?" the female dispatcher asked. "Yes, I'm a medical technician. But what does that change? Aren't you going to send a resuscitation team to me?" "He's dying. Hear me. He's dying," Emily tearfully shouted into the phone. "Calm down, girl. My name is Sarah. I was a medical surgeon in the past. Tell me, would you be able to perform a tracheostomy on a patient under my supervision?" Emily nearly dropped the phone in amazement. "A tracheostomy? But I work in internal medicine, and I've never picked up a scalpel." "That's okay. Calm down and listen to me carefully. There's a first time for everything sometime. If you don't do this, the patient will die of asphyxiation. Do you understand?" Sarah exclaimed. Emily shifted her gaze to the injured James Harrison and realized that there was no other option anyway. What happened next she remembered like a blur. She called the waiter and ordered him to bring a clean towel, a knife, and something to sanitize. Her mother, Jessica, was in the kitchen at the time, helping the chef prepare another order. Emily acted almost mindlessly, as if on automatic. She made an incision with the knife near her throat, inserted the tube, and was relieved to hear the distinctive whistling sound. My God, the patient is breathing, really breathing, ran through her mind. For a while, James Harrison even opened his eyes as if he wanted to say something very important. Tears flowed from the businessman's eyes as he realized that Emily had just saved his life. It wasn't long before the emergency room doctors finally arrived. Emily sat in the corner and cried, crying because she had never been so heartbroken. When Jessica heard what had happened, she ran into the office and began to hug her daughter. I'm sorry, honey. I'm so stupid for listening to your father. You shouldn't have come here and you don't need any money. Let him work it out for himself." Emily looked at her mom in surprise. "You knew about this too, and you didn't say anything?" "At first I kept quiet, but then my dad started blackmailing me into saying that he'd tell me like I wasn't related to you." "Now, you knew?" Emily blurted out. Jessica covered her face with her hands and cried again. Meanwhile, the paramedic on the team began thanking the nurse for the surgery. "Yes, you surprised me, girl, very much. It had to be so skillfully conducted, step by step, and the incision is so neat. Want to show medical students in lectures. I think the surgeon on duty will be grateful to you. That I am A.T. It's Sarah, thanks, your dispatcher. She was the one who directed you." The paramedic was silent for a moment, and then politely said goodbye and followed his colleagues, carrying James Harrison to the ward of the local hospital. And at this very moment, her unworthy father was miles away, in a cozy bed with his mistress Rose. "So, did we spin this thing out pretty good?" The hottie asked. Alex looked at the girl with disbelief, but it's too early to say for sure. You know, James can change his mind 100 times. True, he has already transferred the money to pay off my imaginary debt. Well, I've got it all figured out. Now all I have to do is wait for him to include your daughter in his will, and it's done. Smiled. Alex visibly tensed. "Listen, how did you know that Adamson wanted to include in the will the girl who would agree to commit her life to him?" The pretty girl smiled coquettishly and stood up from the bed, adjusting her robe. "How did you know?" "So the personal notary of this rich man is my half-brother Igor. Didn't you know? He's the one who told me that James intends to make a will in favor of... You don't know who you're talking to, you know? So I decided to use your Emily. What's the beauty to waste? Let her work off the stipends and good treatment." Philip grinned in agreement. He had chosen reality TV for a reason, beautifully ambitious, and smart as that professor. Jessica was a shepherdess from the village, in a word. No brains, no imagination. The only thing Philip was worried about was that James Harrison would die before he could take his daughter as his wife. And if he does, the money will quite expectedly flow into his Alyosha's pockets, and being a wife will wait. All the same, one of them is not his own, and the other is unloved. So what's the fuss? It's better to go to the sea with Rose to rest for a week or two on the sand to fry, get water to treat themselves, to rest, so to speak, from the labors of the righteous, he thought. When Emily left the restaurant, she realized that she just had to see Ben, who'd been feeling better lately. Despite the fact that the guy practically merged, he did not leave the walls of the House of Mercy and began to help not with the sick as an orderly, which is quite a worthy occupation, especially given the specifics of the work. After all, Emily knew very well that vagrants were extremely reluctant to seek help in medical institutions. It is understandable. One has problems with the law, the other has no documents. But when the homeless saw Ben, they knew he was just like them. I mean, he's a poor bastard, a tumbleweed. But how can you not believe him when just yesterday he was collecting empty bottles, scrap metal, and waste paper side by side with you? Ben saw Emily and smiled and waved. "Hey, how's it going?" the guy asked cautiously. She only waved back. "What are you talking about? What business is there? Nothing but trouble. I had to save my..." Ben's face paled. "My fiancé. I didn't know you had a boyfriend." Emily smiled. "Come on, why are you jealous?" "What boyfriend? That's just me joking around. My father's got some kind of combination to get me into a fake marriage to pay off his debt. Only I don't like the whole thing." "Oh, I love it," Ben exhaled in relief. "I was getting upset thinking I'd never see the light of day without you." Emily shook her head with a smile. "You can't even think about that. It's okay. I think that after what happened, Dad will give up on his idea because it doesn't make any sense now." The young people talked some more, and then Emily went home, and Ben continued to work at the homeless shelter. It was always a busy place. The old building was crying out for repairs, but there was no money for it, so they had to screw something on and off and patch things up until their muscles ached. But no sooner had Emily reached the bus stop than her smartphone rang in her purse. Picking up the phone, she was surprised to hear an unfamiliar male voice. "Good afternoon. Emily Jamison Adamson." "Yes, it's me. What's up?" she asked confusedly. There was an awkward pause on the other end of the wire, after which the same ingratiating voice continued. "And I'm Igor Thompson. Perhaps you've heard of him." "No. Why would I have heard of it?" Emily marveled. "Well, if only because I'm a family notary specifically working with James Harrison." Emily shrugged. "So what of it? I'm neither cold nor hot about it." "Well, I can see what's what, after all. Anyway, I'll get to the main point. Tell me, would you mind coming to my office? Let's say in half an hour. It's not far away, Communal Street, Building 8. You'll see the sign there, it's prominent, so you won't miss it." Emily raised an eyebrow in surprise. "Come to you. Why?" "Why? Well, I'll answer it. It's about James Harrison's will," the notary replied. "Well, will? Is he dead? I saw him just a couple hours ago," Emily exclaimed. "No, he's not dead, just admitted to the hospital. But there are arrangements for that as well. So let's not waste each other's time. Anyway, everyone, I'm waiting. Come." Emily wanted to object, but the notary had already interrupted the call, leaving her standing in the middle of a street in confusion. "Okay, whatever, I'll go." What else did they come up with in there? Emily whispered and walked in the opposite direction. What was her amazement when at the notary's office she saw her parents and some woman with a very rough appearance and long legs. As it turned out a little later, the stranger's name was Rose Prudnikova, and she too had her own interest in the case. "Emily, what are you doing here? Didn't that crazy rich guy invite you to this show?" Philip exclaimed. Emily only shrugged uncertainly. "I came because I was told to come. But what claim can there be?" Fortunately, the notary didn't beat around the bush, and after inviting all the participants in the proceedings to come inside, got down to business. "I have gathered you here to announce the decision of James Harrison. Who wants to make his will public early? Is that even possible?" "How is that even possible? You mean I'm going to die tomorrow and you're going to be the heir today? What nonsense is that?" exclaimed Philip, who felt extremely uncomfortable being near his mistress. Rose was making eyes at him, not the least bit embarrassed by his wife's presence. After Philip's words, the notary grimaced and, after a pause, continued. "I repeat once again for those who do not understand. James Harrison has his own view of the situation, and only he has the right to decide when his will be announced to all present. So I'll tell you at once. All financial assets, real estate, the firm. James Harrison is going to leave on the line of Philip Adamson." From astonishment, the young nurse almost collapsed in a faint. "How can I? It must be a mistake. Then tell me it's a prank. Am I caught in the lens of a hidden camera?" The notary smiled. "No, Emily Filipovna. The possibility of a mistake is ruled out. Not only that, you became an heiress by right of descent. That is, being the daughter of James Harrison." "There's a daughter? We took Emily from the orphanage," Jessica shouted. "Well, yes, that's the way it was. That rich man must be out of his mind," Philip chimed in. She measured him with a scornful glance. "No, James Harrison's head is quite all right. There is a forensic medical report dated February 20 of this year that Emily Filipovna is his daughter. If you'd like to read it." February 20th. "But then I didn't even talk to James about marrying off my daughter in payment of the debt. How could he have known all this, and why did he make the will in advance?" Philip did not hold back. Then there was an awkward pause. No one present dared to break it. At that moment, Rose came on the stage, and first of all, she gave her lover a glare and did it defiantly in front of Jessica. "So you're asking, how did James know about all of this?" Rose began in a languid voice. From me, of course. Who else would it be from? All this time, I've been working for James and infiltrating your confidence to instill the idea that you absolutely had to marry your daughter off to him." Philip turned pale, then began gulping for air with his mouth like a beached fish. "But why did you do it? What was the point of it? And how could Emily be his daughter?" Rose smiled. "Very simply. Years ago, James broke up with a girl named Erin. who, without knowing it herself at the time of the altercation, was pregnant by him. Can you guess what happened next? Emily's biological mother suffered from a rare form of blood disease and passed away 3 days after giving birth. That's how Emily ended up in an infant home, from where she was safely taken by you and your spouse. Jesus. So I've been raising James Harrison's daughter all this time, just to please him, Philip burst out. But Rose was not impressed. As it turned out later, James Harrison only found out about his daughter's existence 6 months ago when the donor sample bank gave him a 100 match. That's when the businessman realized that all this time his daughter was around. True, she lived in the family of his subordinate, but who cares? The main thing is that he really did have a daughter. In addition, James had long wanted to expose his manager in fraud, so they sent me Rose with a special task. The businessman wanted to see if the foster father would pass a background check or sell his daughter for money. Since Philip had chosen the second option, James Harrison decided to act as the situation dictated. Now, if Philip hadn't given his daughter away and protected her, the businessman would probably never have been able to tell Emily about his relationship to her. But things turned out the way they did. Seeing her adoptive father in such an unflattering light, Emily waved her hand and left the notary's office in tears. Her mother ran out after her and decided to get a divorce. Frankly speaking, she had previously suspected her spouse of infidelity, but this case was the last straw. On the way to the hospital where her father was lying, Emily told her mother about Ben, that she was in love with him. I peery sincerely. Good for you, daughter. I hope you'll be happy with him. Half an hour later, Emily, Jessica, and Ben were gathered in the room of James Harrison, who had come to his senses and was looking at his daughter with tears in his eyes. And when Ben publicly asked the businessman for his daughter's hand in marriage, James Harrison was over the moon. Responding with approval, the businessman blissfully closed his eyes. Perhaps this was his male happiness, the very thing when you want to go on living no matter what there is for the sake of whom, and also to successfully fight the disease to dance at the wedding of his daughter, whom he had found only 6 months ago. It can't be. I robbed her of her money. The ex-husband froze when he saw his rich wife on TV. In one of Jersey City's parks, children were frolicking, couples were strolling, and young mothers with strollers were relaxing after household chores. Christopher stood by a small fountain, holding a single rose. His hands were trembling with excitement. The young, handsome 20-year-old was waiting for his girlfriend Allison, who was already 20 minutes late. She can't not show up, the young man thought to himself. Christopher had been dating Allison for a couple months now, and he'd never had her late or ignore a meeting. Finally, he saw her thin silhouette in the distance. She wasn't walking, she was floating down the road. Her gait was so graceful and airy. Christopher was tired of waiting for the time to come. He walked towards her, and as soon as the girl approached, Christopher noticed that the expression on her face was sad. "What's wrong?" he asked. "I knew you had some kind of misfortune." Christopher was worried and hugged his favorite girl. Allison didn't hug him back and didn't take the flower. The girl, embarrassed, didn't want to tell the reason for her sadness. Christopher looked her straight in the eyes and asked her to keep quiet. "I'm beginning to worry," he said. "Is your grief so great that you can't even share it with me?" "My grief is you," Allison said, and looked up at Christopher. He tensed. He hadn't done her any harm, hadn't hurt her in any way. He was generally trying to do his best to make Allison happy. He asked for clarification on exactly how he could have spoiled his beloved's mood. "You're very nice, but I'm tired of walking in parks and sitting on benches," Allison said. "You've never once invited me to a restaurant, never given me anything but these roses. You realize I need a man around me, not a boy. There's no hope for you. I can't see you as my rock." You can just say you don't want to have a relationship with a poor man, Christopher said. The boy was insulted, humiliated, and angry. Because of this, he himself was well aware that he had no money. Christopher couldn't give Allison an expensive gift, invite her even to a movie. That would undoubtedly do a lot of damage to his wallet. How can I have money if I'm only 20? Christopher didn't understand. We still have a long way to go. You and I are going to grow and develop together. Allison waved her head. I don't want to wait, I don't want to grow, and I don't want to drag anyone forward, she replied. I want a grown-up, established man. Christopher didn't seem like the kind of man who could ever accomplish anything. Her words cut him to the core. 10 years had passed since then, and he still hadn't forgotten Allison's words. He never met that girl again. How she turned out, he didn't know. But Christopher had learned that all women were only after money, and no one was interested in sincere feelings. Allison gave him a prejudice against all girls at once. Christopher could not build a serious relationship and did not even try to get close to anyone for quite a long time. By the way, there was some truth in Allison's statement. Christopher really did not aspire to a lot of money. He had misunderstood the girl. She wasn't saying that the guy was indigent and couldn't do anything in this life. She just wanted a different standard of living. She wanted to live a rich life, and Christopher could only give her an average one. She tried to explain this to him, but it was all pointless. Christopher wasn't looking for a big paycheck. He was the kind of man who believed that big money could not be earned by honest labor. So he didn't even try. He always said that rich people were either lucky or crooks. But he never thought he would fall into one of those categories, or maybe both. Christopher was already 30 years old when he met Elizabeth. He was working at a car repair shop, and an expensive car had been brought to him. It was the kind of brand their auto repair shop had never seen before. When Christopher saw the owner of the car, his jaw nearly dropped to the floor. Elizabeth noticed the surprise. She was even pleased. The young businesswoman herself offered Christopher her phone number. She didn't look at the lack of men. She could take care of herself and fulfill her own desires. And Christopher thought for the first time that with a girl like Elizabeth, he could try to build something serious. Elizabeth certainly didn't seem mercantile to him in this situation. Rather, he was becoming a keeper. Of course, the man did not assume that a rich girl could consider him as a potential fiancé. But already after the first date, it was clear that Elizabeth was not looking for a one-night stand. Although she was rich, she did not have the main treasure. She was lonely. But it couldn't be said that Christopher was her last option. No, she did take an interest in the simple car mechanic, and Christopher fell in love with Elizabeth. And not just for the money. 6 months into their relationship, he and Elizabeth were married. One day the man caught himself thinking that he was the lucky man he had thought of with contempt throughout his life. The man himself did not seem to have fully realized what he loved more than Elizabeth herself, or the life she had provided for him. And Elizabeth had spared nothing for the one she loved. Christopher no longer needed to work at the auto shop. He was learning the intricacies of running a business. Elizabeth thought about giving him his own car service for their anniversary. But for now, it was just a thought. In principle, she was happy with everything as it was. She was just worried that her spouse might consider himself uncomfortable with the fact that he lived at his wife's expense. But Christopher didn't feel any inferiority. He was more than happy with everything. Elizabeth and Christopher decided to celebrate the first anniversary of their marriage alone with each other without any lavish festivities. The couple booked a table at a restaurant. Before that, they took a boat ride. It was a day just for the two of them. But their plans were not destined to materialize. Throughout the day, Elizabeth received calls from her assistant, Ben. The young man couldn't get through. First, Elizabeth hung up, and then she turned off the phone so that nothing distracted her from communicating with her husband. Ben wrote messages that went unanswered. Eventually, he found out that his boss was celebrating her anniversary at a restaurant, so she was ignoring his calls. Ben had a lot of reasons to worry, and some pretty serious ones. There was no putting off the conversation. In the middle of the evening, when Elizabeth and Christopher were about to exchange gifts, her assistant burst into the restaurant. The girl still hadn't gotten the papers for the car service she was going to present to her spouse. "Elizabeth Igorevna, we agreed with you that if I call more than 3 times, it means that there is trouble," Ben said, panting. He was obviously running to the boss with all his legs. That was why his breathing was labored. Well, what could have been so serious on Saturday, Elizabeth didn't understand. If it was really urgent, you could have written a message and then called. The assistant replied that it wasn't just urgent, it was an emergency. He offered to step aside and talk, but Elizabeth told him she had no secrets from her husband. "You're due for an inspection on Monday," Ben told her. "And it will be the kind of inspection that will find exactly what it's looking for," he added. "We've been through so many of these inspections already that it's simply impossible to intimidate me with them," Elizabeth replied with a laugh. She always used this particular form of her employee's name when she wanted to show that she considered his words to be a mere trifle. "We've been set up this time," Ben said seriously. "Your partner, with whom, let's face it, we weren't exactly working a clean scheme, has been cooperating with the police and with the IRS. He himself was recently nailed, which is why he wants to pull you out after him." Elizabeth tensed. She was starting to worry now, too. She wanted to hug Ben, to thank him for being able to find her after all. But there was no time for tenderness. She needed to find out what Elizabeth was in danger of being tested, and what she could do to avoid the consequences. "Unfortunately, Elizabeth, it could get you jail time," Ben said without joy at all. "And there is only one way to avoid it." Elizabeth was literally numbed by the words of her assistant. She had never expected that one of her business partners could set her up so seriously. The girl conducted her business honestly, without gray schemes and fraud. And she always trusted her partners. It turns out that it was someone's planned scheme to get her out of the game. Ben said that the person who set it all up agreed to go along with it only if Elizabeth would hand over the business to him. But she'd still have to face an audit from the IRS. "How can I get out of this situation?" Elizabeth didn't understand. "You said there was an option, but I don't see any way out. I can't give my business to someone I don't know." "Unfortunately, if you don't sign over all your assets to someone else, you'll be ruined," Ben said. Christopher sat silent the whole time. He didn't understand anything about his wife's affairs. The only thing he could realize was that she was in deep trouble. Elizabeth was crying bitterly, completely confused. Christopher stood next to his beloved and hugged her. The girl clung to his arm. "But you can sign everything over to someone you trust," Ben suggested. "We'll declare you bankrupt. If you don't have anything, there's nothing to take away. It's better to hand everything over to someone close to you than to an obscure character who just wants to make a profit at your expense." Elizabeth raised her tearful eyes to the assistant, looking at him as if her whole life depended on his words. She was so depressed and frightened that she was unable to think straight. Ben had caught the boss by surprise at a moment when she was as happy and relaxed as possible. The news of the impending setup had stunned her. That's what the man was counting on. At any other moment, the girl would have realized that this was some kind of divorce. But now she didn't see the illogic and inconsistency in his words. "You can sign everything over to your parents or to your next of kin," Ben reasoned. "Or someone you trust. Maybe someone from the company?" "You know very well that I have no parents, no brothers, no sisters," Elizabeth answered him. She thought Ben was alluding to himself, but he might not have counted on it because Elizabeth couldn't trust him at that moment. She continued to hold Christopher's hand and suddenly realized, I'll sign the company over to my husband now," she said. "That won't arouse suspicion." "But the husband is also a close relative," Ben said. Elizabeth looked at Christopher and asked him if he would be willing to take on that responsibility. Ben looked displeased. He was clearly expecting the company to go to him. Christopher didn't answer anything, just froze in one pose, as if he wanted to avoid being noticed. "Either I go to prison," Elizabeth said. "But if your husband doesn't want to be involved in your affairs, we can think about it," Ben added uncertainly. "He agrees," Elizabeth said without looking at the assistant. "Well, I guess he does," Christopher said uncertainly. "It's like I don't have a choice." "I will prepare all the documents and come to your house tomorrow to sign them," Ben said quickly. The assistant congratulated Elizabeth and Christopher on their anniversary, wished them a good evening, and hurried away. At last he looked very intently at Christopher. The man could not decipher the emotion that lurked in his gaze. A calm and happy continuation of the evening was out of the question. Elizabeth didn't bother to give her gift. The next morning Ben came even earlier than Elizabeth, and Christopher had time to clean up. The aide had to wait, and at breakfast they sat down together at the table. "I thought a lot about what you said last night," Elizabeth said while Ben was preparing the papers. She had indeed thought about what the assistant had told her, but she didn't analyze his words. Didn't try to find a setup. Elizabeth was thinking about exactly how she could avoid the consequences. It seemed to her that simply transferring the company to her husband was not enough. "Christopher and I should probably get a divorce," she said. Christopher immediately rose from his seat. Ben darted his eyes at his boss. "So what do you think? Do you think the IRS employs fools?" Elizabeth reasoned. "They won't realize we just redid the paperwork when they smell something fishy. If we're divorced, there'll be fewer questions." "Don't worry and don't do anything rash," Ben cautioned Elizabeth. "First of all, we'll do it retroactively. Secondly, we need it more for the competitor than for verification. After all, he wants to deal with you specifically, not your case." "Liz." "I don't like this," said Christopher, who had just been standing there. "I'm definitely not getting a divorce." Elizabeth sighed, waving her hand. "Give me your papers," she said. Doomedly, she leafed through a couple of documents, but more for the sake of appearances, she didn't even read what was written there. She had no reason not to trust Ben. They'd been working together for years. "The documents are signed," the assistant put everything in a folder and promised to straighten everything out. "Expect my call with good news," Ben said. Elizabeth thanked him and finally touched her cup of coffee, which had already managed to become cold. By evening, it had come to Elizabeth's attention that she hadn't gotten herself a copy of the paperwork, that the whole thing was kind of weird in general. In short, Elizabeth began to realize that she had made a mistake. She quickly grabbed her phone and texted her assistant to bring or courier her a copy of the contract. "You don't look well at all," said Christopher, who was suddenly at Elizabeth's side. "I suggest you have a glass of your favorite wine and calm down." He took out a bottle and a glass, quickly filled it, and handed it to his wife. Elizabeth took the drink, thanking him. She stared at one point and thought about something of her own. "I think I did the stupidest thing of my life today," she said quietly and took a sip. "You're just nervous, aren't you?" Christopher tried to reassure her. "You've been thinking about it all day, so you've been having strange thoughts. Have some wine, lie down and rest. Today is done, and tomorrow there will be other things to do. New worries, fresh thoughts." Elizabeth asked Christopher to sit down next to her. As soon as he lowered himself onto the couch, the girl laid her head on his shoulder. She was swollen from just one sip, immediately pulled to sleep. "You're right. I'm so tired that I don't know what I'm thinking." "My eyes are closing," Elizabeth said. "Don't fight it," Christopher said, stroking her head. "You need to rest. You didn't sleep much the night before. You've been on edge all day today, so take care of yourself." Elizabeth relaxed in the warm embrace of her lover, took a couple more sips, set the glass on the small table near the sofa, then returned her head to her husband's shoulder and gradually slid into his lap. Christopher continued to stroke Elizabeth's hair and tell her that everything would be all right. He was scared himself, but he held on for the sake of keeping Elizabeth from worrying even more. Someone had to keep a cool head. Elizabeth hadn't opened her eyes yet, but she already realized something was wrong. Her head ached as if she had emptied several bottles of wine last night instead of just a few sips. She didn't want to open her eyes, so Elizabeth decided to sleep a little longer. She rolled over onto her other side and froze. She realized she wasn't in her own bed because she felt a huge, hard pillow under her head. It was like the one her grandmother had in the village. Elizabeth had always thought it weighed 50 pounds and could kill someone if she wanted to. In her house, there were no such pillows in any bedroom. No sofa could have such a thing. Her cheek was stabbed and feathery. And that feeling, too, was from a distant childhood. Elizabeth remembered perfectly well how unpleasant it was to show the sharp tips of feathers through pillowcases, and she would pull them out of the fabric and examine them. And Granny would scold every time she found a pile of those feathers and fluff under the bed. Elizabeth still risked opening her eyes. She couldn't lie there forever and avoid reality. The room was dusky, but there was a glimpse of sunlight through the thick curtains, indicating that the time had definitely passed the afternoon. The girl did not realize where she was. She couldn't see the room, only a thin line of light from the window, which showed dust particles flying around the room. Elizabeth got out of bed, sliding the curtains open. Outside the window, she saw a wooden fence and a lot of bushes of some kind. It felt like she was at a country house or in a village. She even thought she heard cows mooing somewhere in the distance. Elizabeth slowly turned around in the room and guessed from the furnishings that she had actually found herself in an incomprehensible way in a poor village cottage. The room contained the bed from which the girl had risen a few minutes ago, a stove, a table with a white tablecloth, and a closet. Elizabeth did not understand anything. Never before had she been in this place. How had she ended up here in the first place? The last thing Elizabeth remembered from last night was sitting on the couch with a glass of wine and her husband Christopher beside her. There was no way she could have drunk so much to completely forget everything. Elizabeth didn't have her ID or phone with her. She stayed in the homemade clothes she had been wearing yesterday. How she had gotten to this place was unclear, but one thing was clear: she had to go home. Elizabeth walked towards the exit. When she left the room, she found herself in the kitchen, which was also a hallway. Near the door, she noticed her suitcase, immediately opened it. Inside were several things that someone had hastily left. They were not folded, they were lying in a heap. In a separate pocket lay a passport and a few other documents. Very interesting, Elizabeth stretched out. Did I run away from home or something? Apparently something happened yesterday that made me run away from home. But I couldn't reconstruct the events of the previous day at all. All I remembered was the evening by the fireplace, my head on Christopher's shoulder, and the glass in front of me. I only took a couple sips. There was no way that amount of alcohol could have caused my memory loss. Elizabeth rummaged through more of her suitcase, hoping to find a cell phone there. But there was nothing there. Without that gadget, the girl certainly wouldn't run. She couldn't imagine her life without a smartphone at all. Elizabeth stepped outside. The sunlight hurt her eyes, which were used to semi-darkness. The girl put her palm to her forehead to cover herself a little from the sun and looked around. There were several other huts nearby, as poor and dilapidated as the one in which she had awakened. Some of the huts were definitely abandoned, but the closest one was clearly inhabited. And suddenly Elizabeth noticed an old woman sitting on a bench in the yard of a neighboring house. The girl decided that she could help her. In fact, Elizabeth was very happy when she saw someone alive in the middle of nowhere. She immediately ran up to her neighbor. As she got closer, Elizabeth discovered that the neighbor was not the infirm old woman she had thought she was at first sight. It was just that she was dressed in a very rustic way that gave age. "How do you do?" Elizabeth said. "I apologize for disturbing you, but could you tell me where I am and how I came to be here?" The neighbor looked at her carefully. The woman's eyes were so pale, as if transparent. She seemed to know something, but she was in no hurry to tell. My name is Elizabeth, she introduced herself, thinking it would help her to make the old woman feel at ease. She's alive, after all, the neighbors suddenly said, which completely disconcerted Elizabeth. I saw them bringing you in yesterday. I thought they were trying to close the crime. I almost called the police. But there's no cell phone service here. Elizabeth asked the woman to tell her what she'd seen, and then remembered to get the stranger's name. My name is Mary Adams, the neighbor replied. I suffer from insomnia. I couldn't sleep last night, and then I heard something. It was late at night. A car came to the window. The car was parked in front of the neighbor's house, said Mary. I thought my old lady was coming back. But no. 2 men got out of the car, carried you in their arms, carried you into the house, and drove away. Elizabeth, barely able to stay on her feet, asked Mary to describe the men. I know it was dark, but can you remember anything? Or the make of the car? Elizabeth asked, folding her arms across her chest in a gesture of pleading. I could see clearly. They were shining their headlights so bright that half the village could see them, Mary Adams replied, describing the 2 men who had carried Elizabeth into the house. The girl listened to Mary and could not believe her ears, trying to find some excuses and explanations. She hoped the old woman was wrong after all, but there could be no doubt. After the neighbor described the car, Elizabeth was already sure that her husband and her assistant had brought her here. But how was that possible? Elizabeth didn't even know they knew each other. To her mind, the whole thing was just unthinkable. Did they talk about anything? She asked. I can't tell you that now, Mary Adams replied. I see well for my age, but I don't hear very well. Not even a little, the old woman said guiltily. It was impossible to hear anything. Elizabeth thanked her neighbor once again, went back to her new home. Mary Adams shouted to her that the house was abandoned, so she could stay there as long as she saw fit. And you can come and see me. I'm the only one living here, she added. Thanks, but I'm going into town. By the way, can you tell me how to get there? Elizabeth stopped and asked. The girl stood at the bus stop and borrowed some money from Mary Adams for transportation. She left her things with her too, because she didn't want to carry a suitcase. All she took with her was her passport. She had to walk to her house, which was in the most remote part of the city. Her cottage was located in a place that was considered elite. It was something like a village for the rich. The only way to get there was with a pass, which Elizabeth didn't have with her, of course. But the guard at the gate let her in for old time's sake. What confused her was that he did so reluctantly. Peter, Stephen, have you already forgotten me for one night? Elizabeth joked. But all she got in response was the guard's embarrassment and a guilty look. You will go to the house and find out everything there. I'm forbidden to let you in, and I'll probably get a lot for disobeying orders, Peter replied after a long pause. Elizabeth did not understand anything, although she was beginning to guess. Only yesterday she had signed the papers transferring her business to her husband, and today she had been chased out of the house. The only thing she couldn't understand was why she wasn't allowed in the house. It had nothing to do with the company anymore. Elizabeth rang the bell. At the gate, the door was opened by an unfamiliar man. It was the guard. Elizabeth guessed from the uniform. This is my house. Let me in, she said calmly. Not true. The mistress is home now. The guard answered her. This is the first time I've ever seen you. No wonder, since it's the first day you've worked here. Elizabeth laughed nervously. Get out of my way. I'm the boss. Just then Elizabeth noticed a young girl behind the guard. She was strolling across the courtyard in an icy silk robe. Elizabeth couldn't stand it. She tried to lunge at the imposter, but the guard grabbed the girl and threw her straight to the ground. What's going on here? Elizabeth screamed. I'm in some parallel universe. The girl, who was strolling through the courtyard, noticed the guest, walked smoothly to the gate, and looked at Elizabeth haughtily. "This is my home now," said the stranger, smiling smugly. "And Christopher is mine at last. And you can go wherever you like, but don't set foot here again." So Elizabeth wasn't crazy. It was all Christopher's doing. That was Elizabeth's suspicion, but she couldn't understand why she didn't own the house either. The only place she could find out the truth was in her office. That's where Elizabeth decided to go. She had to walk again because she didn't even have money for a cab. She was terrified of being kicked out of her own company, but she had to talk to her husband no matter what it took. She approached the building where her office was located, noticing that the guards had changed there as well. When only he had time to organize all this, the girl wondered. She had already guessed that she wouldn't be allowed in here now either. But she had to talk to Christopher at any cost. She was lucky she saw that her car, which apparently didn't belong to her anymore either, had pulled into the parking lot. Christopher got out of the car, wearing a nice business suit and a very satisfied look on his face. His face showed that he felt he was the ruler of the world. "He's getting into character fast," Elizabeth thought. She ran up to the bridge, jumped on him from behind, and started hitting him on the shoulders, on the head, shouting insults, while the passers-by watched with interest. The guards ran out of the building and took Elizabeth off Christopher's back. The girl, mad with anger, waved her hand at them, saying, "It's okay, he'll sort it out." But as soon as the guard let Elizabeth go, she threw herself at her husband again and began to beat him with her palms. She didn't know how to fight. She just swung her arms left and right, not even looking where she was hitting. One of the guards grabbed her by the waist, and Elizabeth continued to flail her arms and legs like a bug that has fallen on its back and can't turn over. "I understand your anger, but don't embarrass yourself," Christopher said. "Why are you driving my car? Is there a girl walking around in my house?" Elizabeth shouted. "I've already realized that you've taken the company away from me, but what does that have to do with the property?" "You should have read the documents you signed more carefully," Christopher said calmly. Elizabeth froze. She was no longer hysterical. She realized that she had signed over everything to him. She had no chance of getting anything back. "Was your mistress in the house?" she asked with a hint of contempt. "How long have you been with her?" "It doesn't matter," Christopher said. "Get out of here before they force you out. You're free to go. The divorce petition has already been filed." Elizabeth was released. She didn't throw herself. She stayed where she was and just watched her traitorous husband go to her office, where he would run her business, live in her house, and drive her car. She was so stunned by her spouse's insolence and meanness that she couldn't cry or get angry, nothing. And then she noticed Ben coming out of the office. The former assistant was obviously in a great mood, walking almost at a gallop. Elizabeth rushed over to him. "Why did you do that?" she asked, grabbing Ben by his jacket. He was scared. He hadn't expected to see his former boss. He tried to say something, but he couldn't get a complete sentence out of his mouth out of excitement. He said he didn't know anything, that it was all Christopher's plan, and he wasn't lying about the tests. They were indeed planned. "How could you not know when you brought me documents to sign that said I was giving my husband all my assets? Did you deliberately frame your speeches to confuse me as much as possible? To panic me?" "I really didn't know. They slipped me the wrong papers," Ben continued to lie. "You brought me into the house. Elizabeth came by with Christopher. Did the neighbors see you? Stop lying to me. You set this whole thing up together. By the way, why don't I remember anything?" "Guilt." I was interrupted. Ben lowered his eyes. He realized that there was no point in lying anymore. His complicity in this crime was obvious. And then behind the man's back, some girl screamed. "Oh, brother." Elizabeth recognized that voice at once. It was that thin, gentle voice that had told her hours ago that she was no longer welcome in the house. Ben's face showed that he was not happy with the situation. He didn't want his former boss to know his motives for this deception. "So that's what this is all about," Elizabeth said when she saw the girl. "It's your sister. Have you taken care of the family welfare?" "Elizabeth, you were told to leave." "Go on your way," Ben said when he realized there was no point in hiding anymore. "You can't prove anything. If you go to the police, they'll send you straight to forensics." Elizabeth didn't understand. What kind of examination would they send her to? But Ben quickly explained to her that she had blacked out the day before for a reason. The girl had already guessed that something had been spiked in her wine, and the assistant confirmed it. "The police have been alerted to your case. Unless you want to end your days in a mental institution or behind bars, you'd better not go to the police," Ben warned her. "You've done your homework," Elizabeth said through gritted teeth, clenching her fists. Ben's sister, Sandy, hid behind him because she saw Elizabeth's fighting spirit, but her brother reassured her. "Sandy, don't worry. She won't have time to hurt you. The guards are already on standby," he said. Elizabeth decided to take her almost ex-husband's advice and not embarrass herself anymore. She walked Ben and her sister to the door and then kicked her former assistant's car with all her might. Security guards immediately ran out of the office, and Elizabeth rushed out. She stopped when she had run out of strength and there was no pursuit. Elizabeth was literally gasping for breath. She had never run so much and so fast before. If she could escape from the guards, she could not escape from her own thoughts. Elizabeth realized that through her own stupidity and carelessness, she had lost everything she had earned and accumulated through years of hard work. Elizabeth sobbed. She sat upright on the ground, leaning her back against some unremarkable stall. "Girl, are you scaring my customers like this?" said the indignant stall clerk, who had been listening to Elizabeth crying and mumbling to herself for a long time. But when the woman saw Elizabeth, her mood changed. She realized that the poor girl was in trouble. She could tell by the crying. But Elizabeth looked decent, so she was trustworthy. The woman even asked if Elizabeth needed any help. "If it is not difficult to borrow $3 from me for a ticket to the village," said the girl. "I'm asking for a loan. When I have the money, I will definitely pay you back." "Take one," said the woman and handed Elizabeth a bill. "We'll pay it back, or we won't. That's another matter. At least you can buy yourself something to eat." Elizabeth was also ashamed to accept the handout, but she was in no position to refuse it. She promised herself that she would be sure to pay back Mary Adams, who had given her money for her journey from the village. With that saleswoman, she was sure she would find a way out of the hole she had fallen into through her own gullibility and foolishness. Elizabeth returned to the village. She didn't know where else to go. She had no place in the city in which to find shelter, and here some of her belongings remained, and at least one acquaintance who was willing to take in and help was sweet old Mary Adams. "Yes, the boys are very brazen these days," Mrs. Adams said, listening to Elizabeth's story of how she came to be in this village. The girl had bought the cheapest waffles and cake for her neighbor to thank her for her help. They sat in the kitchen drinking tea. Mary Adams was thinking about how she could help the unfortunate girl, and Elizabeth was thinking about how she could get out of her plight. Though she was engaged in business, she had failed to make any useful connections. The girl did not participate in dubious schemes, did not give bribes, so she could not agree with anyone. The partners did not care who ran her company, she herself or her ex-husband. Mary offered Elizabeth to stay the night at her house, but Elizabeth declined. She felt that she had already squeezed the woman too much. There was no light in the house Christopher and Ben had put her in, but Elizabeth didn't need it. She lit a candle she'd also borrowed from a neighbor. It was enough. It seemed to Elizabeth that she would not be able to sleep and would think about her problems all night. But her strength left her, and she fell asleep as soon as she put her head on the pillow. In the morning, Elizabeth decided to make some improvements to her new home. There was no telling how long she would have to spend here. She wanted to create some semblance of comfort. For the first time, she noticed the decoration of the room. The house seemed to have been abandoned not too long ago. Dust had already accumulated on the shelves, but it didn't look like it had been there for years. In the kitchen drawers, there were still packets of pasta, cereal with expiration dates that hadn't expired. The first thing Elizabeth did was dust. She decided to find a rag and suddenly noticed a note in the most prominent place in front of the front door. She assumed it was a message from her ex-husband to her. With trembling hands, she took the note, began to read it, and from the very first line she realized that the letter was not meant for her. It began with the words, "My dear daughter." Her mother had died a long time ago. She couldn't have left a note for her. But Elizabeth didn't stop reading. The letter was from the woman who owned the house to her daughter. She apologized to her, hoping that her daughter might remember her one day, maybe decide to visit. But the former owner of the house had moved away. She gave her daughter an address where she could find her, begged her to come visit her mother. Elizabeth wiped away the tear that rolled down her cheek after reading the message. So much maternal love and pain in those words written in pencil with a trembling hand. The girl wondered what had happened between mother and daughter that they had to separate and cut off contact for several years. Elizabeth could learn the truth from only one person, so she went to him. "I've been waiting for you," Mary Adams exclaimed joyfully when she saw Elizabeth on the doorstep. "I wanted to come to you to ask you to breakfast." The woman didn't seem to be lying. Her table was indeed already set. Fragrant tea, luscious cakes, pancakes, and cottage cheese. Mary Adams must have gotten up very early to prepare a treat for her new acquaintance. Elizabeth even blushed with embarrassment. "Why do you trouble yourself so much?" Elizabeth was modest. "I'm so embarrassed that I barged into your life." "I'm only glad you did," Mary Adams replied animatedly. "I'm all alone with no grandchildren or children. My neighbor left me. It's good to have you here. I feel sorry for you, though. It's not good for you at all." Mary, a little embarrassed by the last sentence, remembered how Elizabeth had cried the day before and worried that she had lost everything she had. But Elizabeth was not offended. On the contrary, she even smiled. "By the way, I wanted to ask you about your previous neighbor." Elizabeth remembered, sitting down at the table, and the dishes gave off such an appetizing aroma that she wanted to start breakfast as soon as possible. Lucy lived in that house. Immediately the memories rushed back to her mind. Mary Adams was a good womankind. She hadn't been gone that long, not even a year. Lucy and her daughter were unlucky. Did they fight a lot? A lot. "That's interesting to me," Elizabeth said and put the note on the table. Mary put on her glasses, picked up the letter, ran her eyes over it quickly. After reading it, she put her glasses back on the table and looked out the window. She seemed to have tears in her eyes as well. Because of such foolishness, frankly, they feared, Mary said after a long pause. Elizabeth had already managed to whip up a couple of pancakes in the meantime. Catherine is Lucy's daughter. She found a young man in town who wasn't young at all and was about 15 years older, probably, but rich. Lucy did not accept such a son-in-law. They called her daughter all sorts of names. But she and her fiancé had come to visit together. That was the last time Catherine visited her mother, and she told her not to show her face here. Elizabeth set aside the pies and pancakes, listened intently to the story. The girl had lost her mother early. She couldn't imagine how one could choose a groom between a fiancé and a family member. Elizabeth could not condemn either mother or daughter. It seemed to her that a compromise should have been made, but it was easy to reason when the situation didn't concern you. Anyway, after a few months, Lucy regretted everything she'd said. The daughter did not answer the phone and did not come to visit, finished the story Mary Adams. And then Lucy decided to move to the city. hoped that at least there she will have the opportunity to meet with her daughter. But where Catherine went, she didn't know. So now I don't know if they ever met. Somehow I'm dying to know, Elizabeth said suddenly. I have the address. I'll go and ask. And at the same time I'll confess that I've taken over her house. Elizabeth was telling the truth. The thought occurred to her as soon as she read the letter. She wanted to hug the poor woman and feel sorry for her. But she didn't have enough money for the journey. The town was farther away from the village than the one Elizabeth lived in. Therefore, the ticket would cost more. But Mary Adams offered to help her again. Elizabeth was embarrassed, but she would not refuse. The girl was still sure that she would not be in this predicament forever. One day she would have the opportunity to pay back everyone who was helping her. Elizabeth went to Lucy's the next morning. She was ready to go earlier, but the bus left only once a day in the early morning. The girl wondered on the way what she would say to the woman, why she had even considered this trip. But the bus was already pulling up to the train station. It was too late to change her mind. It took Elizabeth about 2 hours to find the right address, and now she stood in front of the door to Lucy's apartment. She tentatively pressed the bell, but it didn't work. Elizabeth already thought that this was a sign that she should go back to the village and continue to think about her own problems, and not solve other people's. But no, she hadn't come all this way just to be scared and come back with nothing. Elizabeth still didn't know why she had come here in the first place or what she would say. But she knocked on the door. No one opened, though Elizabeth knocked several times, and for quite a while. She even thought she heard footsteps outside the door, but no one ever opened. Just as Elizabeth turned around, there was a thud in the apartment, as if something or someone had fallen. There was no doubt about it, the sound came from behind the door behind her. Elizabeth couldn't leave, so she risked opening the door to see if anything was wrong in the apartment and if she needed help. The knob came down and the lock opened. Elizabeth pushed the door open and immediately saw a woman on the floor in the hallway. She seemed to be having a stroke. The girl was frightened. She didn't even have a cell phone to call an ambulance. But Lucy pointed to the kitchen. Elizabeth immediately went where the woman showed her and saw a smartphone on the table. The ambulance came 10 minutes later. Elizabeth went with Lucy to the hospital, spent about an hour in the corridor until the doctor came out to her. "She's fine," the doctor said. "You called the paramedics just in time." Elizabeth breathed a sigh of relief, and then the doctor said that they had already spoken to the patient's daughter. They told her that an unknown girl had come to the hospital. Catherine said she'd be here within the hour. "She asked you to wait for her," the doctor said. "I'll wait for her," the doctor said. "I'll wait for her," Elizabeth replied calmly. She had nowhere to be in a hurry. She thought it would be a great opportunity to reconcile mother and daughter. She was even glad that Katie had decided to come after all. She didn't ignore her mother's problems. So it wasn't too late. Katie arrived quickly, less than an hour later. She ran straight to Elizabeth and knelt down in front of her. "Don't be. That's what anyone in my position would do," Elizabeth said, embarrassed. "The doctor said you saved Mom's life," Katie said, getting up from her knees. "I don't know who you are or how you know my mom, but I'm grateful to you. Ask for anything you want." "Come on, I don't need anything. Will you forgive your mother?" Elizabeth said and handed her the letter she had found in the house. "I didn't go to your mother's house of my own free will. There was this note. It was meant for you, I take it?" Catherine took the sheet, read her mother's message, which had been waiting for almost a year in her home. She couldn't hold back her tears as she read the words written in neat handwriting. Elizabeth noticed the look of guilt, shame, and unspeakable pain in Katie's eyes. "How could I have forgotten about her?" "She could have died alone," Katie said, sinking down on the bench beside Elizabeth. "But how did you end up in her house and apartment?" The doctor reported that Mama had been taken from the city apartment, not the village. Elizabeth was ashamed to admit that she had moved into Lucy's house without her knowledge. But she saw Kathy as a good and kind person who would certainly not judge her. So Elizabeth decided to tell her the whole story from the beginning, so that Katie would have no more questions for her. It was an accident of fate, Catherine said when Elizabeth had finished her story. Stay the night at your mother's in the village. You can't leave tonight anyway, and she will be in the hospital for weeks. Tomorrow morning I will come to visit you and we will talk. Elizabeth thanked the kind girl. She really hadn't thought at all about where she would stay. The buses traveled once a day, not only to the city but also from the city. So she could either walk to the village, which would take her a long time, or take a cab, which Elizabeth simply didn't have the money for. Catherine not only allowed her mother's savior to stay with her, but drove her to the familiar driveway. I'll be there at 9, Katie said goodbye. I hope you won't be asleep by then. Elizabeth re-entered the apartment she had been in for only a few minutes. She found it cozy, but everything about it suggested that it belonged to a lonely and deeply unhappy woman. There were many framed photographs on the shelves. Each picture was of Catherine at a different time in her life. On one was a baby, on another a first grader with puffy bows, on the third already a graduate in a beautiful ball gown. Lucy loved her daughter and missed her in a strange apartment. It wasn't easy for Elizabeth to get comfortable. She had to get used to the idea that she had no corner of her own now. The girl thought a lot about Catherine, what she wanted to talk to her about, but there was no point in guessing. The only thing left to do was to wait until morning to see if Catherine had been deceived. Catherine knocked on the door at exactly 9 o'clock in the morning. Elizabeth was surprised that the girl knocked. She was not the mistress of the house, so Catherine could have entered her house unannounced. But Elizabeth even asked permission to enter and clarified exactly where they could set up to talk. Mother is feeling better and would like to thank you, Catherine said as she sat down at the table in the kitchen. Elizabeth poured tea, but there was nothing else she could offer her guest. She even took the tea bag without asking. If you don't mind, we'll go to the hospital after we talk, Catherine said. Of course, I also have to thank your mother, after all, to get to know her. I'm her lodger. It turned out that Catherine was floundering, did not know how to get to what she wanted to talk about. Elizabeth guessed that Lucy wasn't the topic of conversation. I remember you telling me your story yesterday, Catherine began to say. You were running a successful business, and I found some articles about you on the internet. It's amazing that a businesswoman like you could be so foolishly deceived. I trusted both Ben and my husband, Elizabeth replied, feeling an inexplicable sense of guilt. I was just intimidated and confused. They were people I didn't expect to be set up at all. Don't think I'm trying to shame you or make fun of you, Catherine said, as she realized that her words might have sounded like mockery. Quite the opposite. I would like to discuss some details with you. I have a proposition for you that you'll like, especially given the position you're in. Elizabeth raised her head and squared her shoulders. Her whole appearance showed that she was ready to listen to the terms and offers. Catherine immediately saw in front of her a strong woman, a real businesswoman. Until then, Elizabeth seemed to her as a lost girl. But her ex-husband and assistant could not bury in her a confident businesswoman. I wasn't, and I'll be honest about it, Catherine said. Before voicing her proposal or even a request, Catherine told the backstory. She admitted that she married a man who was 18 years older than her. Mary Adams got it a little wrong, but she entered into marriage for love. Catherine also revealed that this was the reason why she and her mom had a fight. Elizabeth was silent about the fact that she was already aware that she was the cause of discord between mother and daughter. 2 months ago, my husband passed away, Catherine said sadly. No sooner had I recovered from this loss, although not yet, to be honest, as I had to face a new problem, the heirs. Other than our mutual son, only 3 years old, my spouse had no children. His business is passed to me. But I don't understand anything about it. I am afraid that I too could be cheated by assistants and accountants and other employees. Anybody could set me up because I don't understand anything about the paperwork. So I would be very happy if you would become my right hand. Teach me how to run the business and help me get the company out. Because with me at the helm, my late husband's company is going downhill. Elizabeth was pleased that Catherine had decided to entrust her with such a responsible task, even knowing that she herself was dressed like a little girl. She even asked Catherine if she was embarrassed by that fact. Not at all, Catherine replied calmly. You've been running a successful business for several years. I read that you built your company from scratch. Why can't you promote an established and successful business? Personal motives played into your business. You were deceived by people close to you. I have a different situation. I'd be happy to help you. Elizabeth agreed. Catherine hugged her new acquaintance, thanked her for this answer, offered Elizabeth to immediately give an advance payment so that she could rent an apartment, settle in for the first time, buy food, new clothes. After the conversation, the girls went to Lucy's hospital, where the woman tearfully thanked Elizabeth for saving her life. But she was even more grateful for reconciling with her daughter. After her first day of work, which was Elizabeth's abbreviated day, she drove to the village. The purpose of the trip was one thing: to talk to Mary Adams, to settle her debts. Elizabeth couldn't even figure out what Mary Adams was happier about: the fact that her new neighbor had done well and found a job, or that Lucy had reconciled with her daughter. The woman did not want to accept money from Elizabeth, but she said she would be offended and would not forgive herself if Mary did not accept her debt. Elizabeth also wanted to visit the stall clerk, who was also kind to her. But she had to go to another town for that, not the one where she had settled. Now she didn't want to spend half a day on the bus, so Elizabeth decided that she would thank her when she bought a car. By the way, she was able to do so after 6 months. All in all, in the entire 6 months, Elizabeth had almost completely recovered from her collapse. She became not just an assistant and business consultant for Catherine, she became the second person in her company. The girls were able to not only save the business, but powerfully propel it forward. Catherine was well aware that without Elizabeth's help she could not have done it, and therefore generously thanked the girl with a high salary. Elizabeth had not lost her entrepreneurial spirit. She tried not to waste a lot of money. After she bought an apartment and a car, she started saving for her own business. It was not the first time she started from scratch. She'd already managed to start a business once and create a successful construction firm. So she would do it again. It took the girl 3 years to get back on her feet. She was still a long way from her previous fortune, but last time it had taken her years to get her business off the ground. Now, however, things were progressing much faster. Elizabeth did not forget Mary Adams and the saleswoman, who had been kind to her. She had paid off the second one too, and they had even managed to chat. The woman at the stall was named Tatiana, and she told her that she was deeply unhappy. Her own son had died in a hot spot, and she was all alone. Elizabeth had no idea how many lonely women there were in the world. She thought about the fact that there was no one to take care of them. For example, Mary Adams complained that she herself had to chop wood for the winter, shovel snow, go for water. It is not good for an old woman to do such hard labor. When Elizabeth had her own business and money, she thought about creating a foundation. The girl found volunteers who agreed to help old people and single women with hard physical labor on a free basis. The news of such a fund quickly spread around the city. Elizabeth was even interviewed for the regional channel. Christopher got up early to prepare for the meeting. The company wasn't doing as well as Elizabeth. He was nervous. The partners were refusing to cooperate. If at first no one cared who was at the helm of Elizabeth's company, after a while they realized that there was a difference. Christopher had never been a businessman, and things were not going well for him. He couldn't get organized on one level of his company. There was no way Ben could single-handedly pull the firm off the bottom, and so far they were still afloat. But the outlook for the next few years was bleak. Added to the fact that Christopher not only didn't know how to earn money, he spent it recklessly. And he had an assistant in the form of Sandy. This young beauty didn't worry about money at all. The money from her card, and consequently from Christopher's accounts, flew away like leaves from trees in the fall. Christopher had a habit of eating breakfast with the news. It was a habit he'd had since his days at the car service center. He brewed his coffee, set a plate of freshly cooked scrambled eggs in front of him, and turned up the volume on the TV. Just as he took the first sip of the aromatic, invigorating coffee, the drink immediately spurted out in a fountain onto the table. The thing was, he saw a familiar face on the TV. Elizabeth, in an expensive suit, beautifully styled and wearing expensive jewelry, was talking about her charitable foundation. She was definitely doing well. After the interview, the announcer talked about how Elizabeth is a successful entrepreneur and is already moving the local rich people from the top position. How is that possible? I ripped her off. Christopher said out loud. If a man has brains, he is not lost in the world, said Sandy, who had just woken up to the smell of coffee. That can't be said for you. Christopher was furious when he heard his lover's words. He reminded her that she wasn't exactly frugal either and had contributed significantly to their ruin. I thought you were going to be a businessman, she said unashamedly. Money is supposed to work and multiply itself, and for some reason you have only disadvantages. You should learn from your ex. The man could not stand such insults and obvious mockery from the girl, grabbed her by the hair and pushed her out into the street right in her pajamas. She shrieked, begging to be let go, but Christopher couldn't stop. She had hurt him too much with her remarks. Christopher was already thinking that his mistress had stopped seeing boundaries. More than once she had made insulting remarks about Christopher, especially if she didn't have enough money for new jewelry or dresses. Sandy could only demand and judge. It was impossible to get support and help from her. Come to my place and get your sister out of here, Christopher told Ben over the phone. What do you mean, take her away? Ben didn't understand. Literally, I don't need her anymore. I'm going back to my wife. And Sandy's standing outside the fence in her pajamas. And the longer you drive, the longer she'll have to walk down the street in God's pajamas. Christopher replied and hung up the phone. He wasn't joking or speaking in haste. He really intended to get Elizabeth back. He couldn't handle the business alone. The money would soon run out, and Elizabeth was obviously doing well. He thought that his ex-wife would immediately forgive him and take him back. All the more reason for him to return everything to her, provided she agreed to remarry him. Before leaving for another city, Christopher thought that Ben might harm him in some way. So he decided to fire the assistant and informed him about it by phone. You realize that without me, the end of your empire will come even faster. Ben answered him, who was also furious that his sister had been thrown out on the street like an unwanted kitten. Don't worry, my ex-wife will fix my affairs, Christopher answered, starting the engine. She would have fired you anyway. No one would want to work with a traitor. He hung up. Ben looked at his sister, who still couldn't get warm in the car. Did he seriously think Elizabeth would forgive him and welcome him back with open arms? Sandy asked through gritted teeth. No, of course not. She's not stupid, Ben told her. But we can try to gain her trust and punish the bastard. What city does she live in now? Did you see it on the news? Sandy nodded. Ben smiled and stepped on the gas. He and his sister are going to Elizabeth's place too. Just need to change their sister's clothes first. Ben decided that the mistress shouldn't be taken to see Elizabeth. She would be more able to confide in him without her. Sandy didn't insist. She didn't feel like traveling across town, but she advised her brother to call Elizabeth, because Christopher would definitely be there sooner. Elizabeth enjoyed the beautiful morning. Even though it was getting close to lunchtime, She'd given herself a chance to get some sleep that day. She and Catherine had had a party the night before to celebrate a successful transaction. The peaceful flow of the morning routine was broken by a phone call. Elizabeth had hoped to hear anyone but the man who had left her in the lurch a few years ago. "Ben?" Elizabeth said questioningly. "Did you get the wrong number?" "No. I want to warn you that another man from the past is coming to see you soon," the man said seriously, though his knees were trembling with excitement. "Your ex-husband has found out you're back on the horse and wants to suck on your income. Christopher himself couldn't replicate your success. He's almost out of money." Elizabeth replied that's what she thought. But Ben is worried for nothing. The girl would never forgive her ex-husband in her life, would never believe him. "I understand that." Unlike him, he laughed. "You want to get back at him, don't you? I have an idea." "I'm not surprised you have another plan to trick a man." Elizabeth's former assistant jabbed at him as well. "What I don't understand is, why would you want to do that? I mean, you two are kind of related, and even related." And Ben told him what Christopher had done to him and his sister. So he had a strong motive for revenge, too. Elizabeth still agreed to listen to his plan. She found his arguments convincing. Elizabeth was also attracted to the fact that this time her safety would not be threatened. So this wasn't another scheme to take everything away from her. Elizabeth was even looking forward to hearing from her ex-husband. There was no way Christopher could think of a way for him to show up. He wanted to make sure his ex-spouse didn't guess his intentions, as if he didn't know she was rich again. Christopher tracked Elizabeth down, finding out where she lived and worked. As if by chance, he found himself in the same establishment where Elizabeth got her coffee every morning. "What meeting?" Christopher exclaimed, meeting Elizabeth there. Yes, unexpected indeed, Elizabeth played along, who had long known that her husband was tracking her. The guards had already reported to her a few days ago that a man was following her. Christopher asked Elizabeth how she was doing, telling her that he was doing fine except for his love life. "Wow, your mistress only wanted money." Elizabeth ironically repeated after him. "Is this boomerang coming back to you?" "It's not true, I wasn't with you for money." Christopher answered her resentfully. "Ben and his little sister tricked me. She seduced me, and he put me up to it." Elizabeth nodded, looking understanding. It looked very exaggerated, and Christopher could see the obvious mockery on his ex-wife's part. Nevertheless, he was pleased that she did not stop talking to him, listened immediately, and even entered into a dialogue. All of this Elizabeth had done deliberately. She needed to gain his trust so that Christopher would think she had fallen for his bait again. And she succeeded. After the first meeting, Christopher was sure that after a couple more conversations and dates, he would be a rich woman's husband again. And Elizabeth was happy to play along. Each time she forced herself to communicate with her ex-husband, but she realized that without it, her revenge would not happen. She needed to feign trust and warmth toward a man she couldn't stand. Listening to Christopher's words was simply unbearable for her. She realized that he was a masterful liar, and believe her, he really wanted to deceive. Even though she knew that every word he said was a lie. Christopher was getting more and more turned on because he couldn't tell if Elizabeth trusted him or not. It seemed to him that everything was happening too easily. Immediately, his ex-wife agreed to a date, answered his phone instantly. Was she so starved for a relationship, so lonely that she forgave him so easily? Christopher went on the offensive, sending her gifts, arranging surprises, dates. He thought she was about to melt. Elizabeth stepped over herself when she went to these meetings and smiled sweetly at her traitor husband. She was even more disgusted when she saw Christopher cowering before her, the bastard squealing. "Ben, I'm getting tired of these meetings with my ex-husband. When do we move on to the next phase of the plan?" Elizabeth asked him after another date. "We need to push Christopher into action. Until he's ready to give it all back to you, We're not going to get anywhere, Ben told her. How do you push him to do that? I'm already pretending to be in love and forgiving all the wrongs, Elizabeth clarified. Next to Elizabeth at that moment was Catherine. She came to visit her to discuss personal matters. The girls had become not only business partners, but also best friends. I have an idea, Catherine said suddenly. Elizabeth immediately put the call on speaker so that Ben could hear her. Men are most afraid of competition. If Christopher found out that Elizabeth had a suitor for his heart, he would immediately move into decisive action. Ben agreed that it was a good idea. As a man, he confirmed it. Katie then informed him that she had a good acquaintance who would agree to help her. Christopher didn't know how to propose to Elizabeth himself. He still doubted that she had finally forgiven him. Suddenly, he received a call on his work phone. Since Ben had been fired, Christopher scheduled all negotiations and meetings by himself. He received a call from a man who introduced himself as a well-known investor, and Christopher knew his name. It was a man named David. This was a weighty figure in their field. Many people knew him, and everyone dreamed of working with this man. Christopher even straightened his back, although the person on the phone still couldn't see him. Christopher prepared for the meeting with the investor as carefully as for a date. Until the last moment, he didn't believe that the David he had in mind would come to the meeting. But his expectations were justified. After a short negotiation, the businessmen shook hands, but David was in no hurry to leave. "Is it true that Elizabeth Agorevna is your ex-wife?" David suddenly asked. Christopher nodded and immediately tensed. This question did not bode well. David said that a friend of his was interested in the woman. He begged me to find out if Elizabeth had a boyfriend, David said, blushing. "I'm sorry to bring it up." "That's all right," Christopher coughed. "It's good of you to ask. Elizabeth and I are discussing the possibility of starting a family right now. I want to propose to her because our feelings are back." "That's too bad, because my friend was going to take her out tonight," David said. "But then I'll tell him he has nothing to look forward to." "Yes, please do." Christopher's voice became high, like a frightened boy's. Christopher waited until David left the restaurant and immediately called Elizabeth, asking her not to plan anything for the evening. He had a serious conversation to have. Wow, that worked so fast. Elizabeth was surprised. She knew at once that Christopher had prepared a serious conversation. He had dressed like a real groom, prepared a huge bouquet, and was very excited. Elizabeth sank into a chair and showed that she was ready to listen to him. Christopher pulled some papers out of his briefcase, got down on one knee, and handed Elizabeth the ring. "I want it all back," he said, to prove that he was serious. "I have prepared the documents that will give you everything back, everything that I took away. You will be my wife again." Elizabeth did not hurry to take the ring, open the folder with the documents, read them carefully, every line, every word. When she was sure that this time there was no deceit, she put her signature in the right places. "When did you have time to prepare them?" She was surprised. "But I was on my way to you with them," Christopher said. "You can see the date I wrote and signed them. It shows that I'm serious." While Elizabeth read the papers, Christopher remained on one knee with his arm outstretched. He was very worried. But since the girl signed the papers, then the deed is done. "It's a shame that you're giving me back much less than you took," Elizabeth began to say. And Christopher immediately realized that he was too happy too soon. "And I gave you the company in a very different state of mind. But thank you for that. You can offer your ring to Sandy. I don't need anything else from you, if that's what it takes. I'll make a deal with the police, just like you did. I was wiser this time." Elizabeth took the folder with the documents, got up from the table and left the restaurant. Christopher remained sitting on one knee. He could not believe his ears. He now found himself in Elizabeth's shoes. She had tricked him too. A waiter approached Christopher, asking if he wanted to pay the bill. "What bill?" yelled at the kid, furious. "Didn't you see that? Didn't she just take everything from me? How am I supposed to pay for it?" The waiter was startled by this reaction, but kept his cool. He asked the man to calm down and told him that he would have to call security and maybe even the police if Christopher didn't pull himself together and pay for his order. But he had no intention of calming down. Christopher was furious. He was realizing more and more every second that he had literally become a tramp. He threw all sorts of unflattering words at Elizabeth, who could no longer hear him. He started smashing everything, breaking chairs, tables, and sweeping dishes from the tables of other visitors. But he was quickly calmed down and tied up by the guards. "Christopher, why did you embarrass yourself like that?" "You are a respectable man," said the owner of the restaurant. While the bound Christopher and the staff waited for the police, the man's words echoed in Christopher's mind. He remembered how, years ago, he had asked Elizabeth to calm down and not embarrass herself by throwing her fists at him in the middle of the street. He could understand her pain now, her feelings. Only the girl was much more hurt and offended. She had been robbed of her hard-earned blood and sweat, and he had been robbed of something that had never belonged to him. It was cold and calculated revenge, and Christopher accepted defeat. He decided that now he would definitely settle down, go back to his car service. He could try on a rich life and realize that money doesn't just fall out of the sky. He had everything, but he couldn't save it. When Elizabeth walked out of the restaurant, she raised the folder above her head and shouted with joy. And in the car already waiting for her was Katie, who immediately ran out of the car, hugged her friend. The girls went to celebrate their victory in the club. On the way to the club, Elizabeth called Ben and told him that the deed was done. Christopher was left with nothing, and she got back all her own. The man was pleased with the outcome, even venturing to ask if Elizabeth would hire him again. "No, I've had enough of this once," Elizabeth laughed. "I am grateful for your help. I can send you some money to thank you and pay you for your work, for warning me, but you can't expect more than that. I'm sorry, once a man has betrayed you, you can't trust him." "Only enough talk," exclaimed a happy Katie. We were already at the club. Elizabeth said goodbye, hung up the phone, and looked at the huge building with its thousands of lights on. She had never been to such places, but her friend reassured her that it was a decent place and only rich people vacationed there. And there David was waiting for them. Elizabeth did not know about it. She did not even communicate with him. This Catherine agreed about everything with her friend, and the meeting at the club was organized by her at David's request. The man had long been interested in this young, successful businesswoman. He himself was also young and attractive, but had no success in his personal life. All the girls who literally hung around his neck did not seem worthy to him. Many needed money. Their behavior was not distinguished by modesty. And David wanted to find a decent girl, whom he would see as his future wife and mother of his children. Elizabeth seemed to him just like that, and he fell in love with her at first sight. David later admits to Elizabeth that he could hardly hold a conversation with her ex-husband. He disliked liars and cheaters so much, but when he looked at Christopher and realized that this man had caused a lot of pain to this beautiful girl, the urge to punch him in the face was self-inflicted. Catherine didn't bother to tell Elizabeth that David was actually interested in her friend. The girl wasn't sure if her buddy was ready for a relationship. She hadn't promised David anything except that she would introduce them. And the introduction was a success. Elizabeth was in a good mood, smiling, almost bouncing with happiness. And David just couldn't contain his smile as he watched such a happy and therefore even more beautiful Elizabeth. "I owe you one," Elizabeth said happily to David. "How did you manage to convince my ex-husband that I had a boyfriend and he signed everything back over to me the same day?" "Men don't like competition," David answered her with a smile. "But I wasn't lying about your suitor. I do have one." David blushed, but because of the darkness in the club, Elizabeth didn't notice it. The confident, successful man who runs a dozen businesses felt at that moment like a schoolboy shy of talking to a girl. Elizabeth danced and behaved casually, not even realizing that her interlocutor was burning with shame and shaking with embarrassment. "Then introduce me to him. What if this is my destiny?" Elizabeth laughed, who was in a great mood, and said it not seriously, more as a joke. But David literally blossomed before her eyes. When he heard these words, Elizabeth, he began to correct his jacket and hair, and then extended his hand to the girl. Elizabeth stopped dancing at this metamorphosis. She looked at David seriously, trying to determine whether she understood correctly what would happen next. "Then let me introduce myself. I am the admirer," he said with contrived importance. It looked ridiculous again, because the man was terribly shy. He tried to give the impression of a serious man, but his excitement was getting in the way. Elizabeth was confused at this point, but she shook his hand. David was a handsome man, and outwardly Elizabeth was attracted to him. But the girl did not think about serious and non-serious relationships. It seemed to her that after her first marriage, she would remain a loner forever. Catherine watched from the side how her friend and old comrade communicate. She really wanted Elizabeth to find her happiness, and she knew for a fact that David was the perfect match. He would definitely not be with Elizabeth for the money. He is a loyal and decent man. Those were the arguments she made to her friend the next day. Elizabeth embarrassed. She too was well aware of what an important and powerful businessman David was. She couldn't believe she could be looked up to by a man of such high rank. "And you're not an ordinary girl," either Katie told her. "There's nothing to be surprised about. Give David a chance, you'll never meet anyone like him again." And Elizabeth heeded her friend's advice. She went on a few dates with David, accepted gifts and advances from him, and eventually they formed a beautiful couple. A year and a half later, Elizabeth and David became a family. Elizabeth did meet Christopher. It was unexpected. She had a flat tire somewhere on the outskirts of town, namely near a tire shop. Elizabeth even laughed that the owners of the tire shop had put something on the road just to get a customer. Never before had there been such an expensive car in this godforsaken place. Unfortunately, the owner's only employee was a half-drunk Christopher. Elizabeth recognized him immediately and said she wouldn't let him near the car. She called David and asked him to come and get her in the car. But while she waited for her husband, she decided to talk to Christopher. He told her without much enthusiasm that he had been working at the place since he was released from the police. After the debauch in the restaurant, he lived in a dormitory, and the only joy in his life was a bottle of vodka. Christopher watched with hatred and envy as Elizabeth got into David's car and they drove off to their happy life. "To each his own," Christopher said, his voice hoarse with hangover. "And we haven't lived rich. There's no reason to start." Emily arrived home to find her husband's mistress standing in front of her, and when she held out the document, "What a lovely day today," Emily exclaimed, putting on the table a sumptuous dish of roast duck. "I'm so glad we decided to have lunch with your brother today," Susan said, looking around the table and realizing that everything was in place. She clapped her hands together in satisfaction. A satisfied smile appeared on her face. Her dear, beloved husband, John, came over to her, put his arm around her waist and pulled her close. Emily felt a pleasant warmth on her back, turned around to face him and kissed him on the lips. It had been a full 3 years since they had known each other, and a full 5 months since their wedding day. Emily adored her husband, considered him the closest thing she had to a man. He was well-built, handsome, intelligent, the kind of man one could never find. Emily considered herself lucky. John's hands moved lower, gripping her thighs tighter. "Honey, not now. We have guests coming over," she said, laughing. John was still holding her in his arms, trying to reach her warm neck with his moist, cool lips. Emily kept dodging and laughing, enjoying the sudden game. But then the doorbell rang. Emily opened the door in front of her guests and saw her brother John on the doorstep. "This is Ashley." He introduced his girlfriend. Emily took a quick glance at the attractive woman with slender legs and a bushy mop of black hair. She was petite and fragile. The gray eyes and thin lips on her pale face spoke of a sensitive nature. "Nice to meet you. Come in," she said. Soon John appeared. He greeted the guests, shook his brother's hand, and glanced at Ashley, sizing her up. He kept his emotions to himself. "Let's get to the table," Emily broke the silence. "How did you two meet?" She cut off a piece of duck. The meat was very tender, sent a small piece into her mouth, and then looked up at Ashley, wanting to hear the story of their acquaintance. The girl was a little confused, taking a napkin to wet her lips. Michael beat her to it. Taking a sip of wine, he began to tell the story of their first meeting. Ashley was giving a seminar at our hospital. A very interesting topic, by the way. He picked up a golden potato with his fork. The effects of drugs on the human body. Emily raised her eyebrows, surprised at the topic his girlfriend had chosen. "Are you a medical professional too?" "I graduated from medical school," Ashley explained, lowering her gaze to her plate. After a second, she glanced at John, who kept his gaze on her. He was sitting diagonally, acting like an observer studying the object that caught his eye. "Did you know?" Emily interrogated her husband. The man, not understanding what she was talking about, interrogated his wife again. It turned out that John had fallen out of the conversation a little, immersed in thought. "Oh my. I did not know that the usual drugs can be real killers. It sounds fantastic." She was genuinely surprised. "Are you planning to get married?" "All you need to know," Michael replied cheerfully. Emily glanced over at Ashley. She replied that they were thinking about it. After a hearty dinner, it was time for hot tea and sweet dessert. "Be careful. There's a risk of swallowing your tongue, because this pie is so good," Emily said as she set a gorgeous strawberry pie with whipped cream on the table. "Did you make it yourself?" Michael wondered. "I got it from the bakery around the corner," she joked. The audience supported her with laughter. "Next week I'm going on a business trip to Germany," John's brother said. He explained that he was being sent on a training course, a long-time dream. There is nothing better than sharing experiences. His brother and his wife supported him. They congratulated Michael on this pleasant news. The dinner came to an end, and the guests, thanking for their hospitality, went home. "But do you think they'll make it?" Emily asked her husband John while putting the dishes in the dishwasher. He replied that they probably would, because they love each other, and you can see it on their faces. Emily finished cleaning up the kitchen, then wrapped her arms around John's neck and pressed herself against him. "I missed you so much," she said, kissing him on the lips. He kissed her back. They snuggled into each other, wrapping each other in an embrace. They walked through the hallway, ending up in a dark room. The deeper they went into it, the more the darkness engulfed them, hiding their silhouettes from view. Deep breathing was heard, the rustle of clothing. Emily was cleaning the house one day, checking the dust and putting things in their places. In the background, the television was playing a program about traveling. Suddenly, it stopped abruptly. There was a breaking news broadcast. The television announced that Flight RU-295 New York-Los Angeles had to make an unscheduled landing in Denver, the newscasters said. Emily knew that Michael was supposed to be on that flight. She immediately called her husband, telling him about it. John replied that he would call his brother back and find out what had happened. But after dialing his number, John heard only short beeps. A little while later, he got a call from Ashley. "Hello, John. Hi. Did you call? Yes, Ashley, hi. I wanted to know what flight Michael was on. Emily said there was an emergency landing on TV on a flight to Los Angeles. What? Emergency landing? What was the flight number? The girl asked. John called out the numbers, and then Ashley breathed a sigh of relief. No. Luckily, Michael has a completely different flight number and he's fine. Don't worry. I just finished talking to him, she replied convincingly. John was in no hurry to end the conversation. Was there anything else? Ashley asked. No, I think it's all clear now, John replied and reluctantly said goodbye. In the evening, he returned home as usual. Emily was waiting for him there. She was happy to see her beloved husband again, asked about his mood, sat down at the table, poured tea into mugs. But suddenly she felt sick. It had happened to her before, and she knew it would pass soon. The thing was that Emily suffered from anemia, which was not well treated. She took daily vitamins to keep her healthy, but it had little effect on her daily life, except now. Only her doctor had warned her that with such a condition, she was unlikely to be able to bear and deliver a child. It made Emily sad, and she often brought it up, fearing that perhaps John wanted children, but with her around, it was unlikely he would ever be able to realize it. Is everything all right? John asked, gently holding his wife under her elbow and around her waist. A little more, and Emily stopped feeling dizzy. We should see another doctor, John suggested. Emily carefully lowered herself onto the cushioned seat. How long have you been seeing him? There's no improvement, and I think it's the opposite, her husband said. Well, don't say that. Dr. Valerie's a very good specialist, Emily said, and started dinner. John decided not to argue with her, knowing that Emily herself was very careful about her health. After dinner, the couple went to bed. The next day after work, John left the office, headed to his car, walking, trying to find the keys in his pocket as he walked. By chance, he noticed a familiar figure to his right. He stopped his gaze briefly and suddenly saw Ashley standing in front of him. She was leaning over the open hood, obviously trying to find the cause of the malfunction. John couldn't pass by without helping her figure it out. He went over to her and leaned over the hood. I don't understand what's wrong here, she asked rhetorically, placing her right hand on her hip. She knew someone had approached her, but looked up in surprise and exclaimed, "Ah, John, how timely you are here," he answered, deliberately lingering his gaze on her eyes. I always show up at the right place at the right time. John then turned his attention back to the car and concluded that the car repairman was needed. Ashley sighed regretfully. Don't worry, I'll take you where you need to go, John said, easing Ashley's plight. Oh, I'd appreciate that, she said, tucking a strand of black hair behind her ear. John opened the door to his car and Ashley sat down happily. They drove in almost complete silence, occasionally exchanging a few words. John asked how Michael, who was now in Berlin, was doing. Ashley replied that he was happy to be there, that he was doing well, and that he was glad that he hadn't turned down the offer. I am very happy for him. I remember Michael always dreamed of being a doctor since he was a kid. And it looks like it's coming true, John concluded, glancing at Ashley. Soon they were in the driveway of the house. Ashley was carrying a heavy bag, and John offered to help her carry it upstairs. She agreed. A few minutes later, they were in a small but cozy apartment. Michael had purchased it a year ago, taking off his high-heeled shoes. Ashley walked to the kitchen and offered John something to drink. Without hearing his response, she pulled out 2 glasses and splashed some whiskey. John was a little discouraged by what was happening, because he wasn't going to stay long. But he couldn't refuse such a beautiful girl either. At that moment, Ashley was wearing a beige dress with black stripes that emphasized her slim figure. She went to the window, opened it, and then took out a cigarette and smoked. John had no idea that she could act so relaxed in company with Michael. She always gave the impression of a nice and proper girl. John stared at her, and at the orange flame that grew stronger with each new puff of Ashley's smoke. There was a fire burning inside John that he didn't want to let go. The girl inhaled the thick stream of smoke eagerly, opening her sensual lips slightly. Her languid gaze made John question his ability to keep his composure. This attractive, delicate girl with white skin, graceful neck, beautiful shoulders, and hips seemed the epitome of defiance. John walked over to the table, picked up his glass, and took a small sip. Ashley offered him a smoke as well. Everything happened in silence, as if they were both enjoying the atmosphere. John took the cigarette from her hands with his index finger and thumb and brought it to his lips. He did something he didn't usually do. He covered his mouth and let the smoke drift away, without taking his eyes off the girl. And John himself didn't notice that he was already kissing her. It was a blur, a fleeting loss of judgment. But what a sweet moment it was, full of feeling and passion. If it hadn't been for the phone call, John would hardly have been able to come to his senses. It was his wife, Emily. She was already waiting for her husband at home and told him that dinner had long since gone cold. "Don't worry, darling, I'll be there soon. I had to stay late for work. I've been so busy, I forgot to call you," John said, looking at Ashley. She lifted the corners of her lips slightly. John found her smile charming, and he smiled back. "I'm on my way." "Kisses," he said, and then he hung up the phone, still looking at Ashley, realizing that he didn't want to break up with her at all. But if he did, he wasn't doing right by his wife. Just before he left the apartment, he stopped for a moment and looked at the girl who had stirred new feelings inside of him today. He knew that he should not continue with what had happened. So with just one last glance at the searing brunette, he walked out the door. When John returned home, his beloved wife met him here. She, as always, met him on the doorstep with a hug and a kiss. "I waited for you. Today you were delayed, not on a joke," she said. She looked tired. John answered her with the usual phrase, and then went into the kitchen, put some food on his plate, and sat down at the table. Emily was telling him about the day before, but John's thoughts were now directed in a completely different direction. He put his fork to his mouth, but he couldn't help but think about Ashley. She seemed so mysterious, so alluring and mysterious. He wanted to keep being around her, to unravel what lurked behind her appearance. He couldn't get rid of the image in front of his eyes, namely her gray eyes, lined with black pencil, her long eyelashes, and her open mouth. "John, are you here?" Emily interrogated him when she didn't get an answer to her question. "Did you ask something?" As if waking up, said her husband. "What did you do at work today?" Emily asked the question again. John shrugged his shoulders slightly, tilted his head to the left, and began to make up as he went along the flurry of activity he'd supposedly pulled off after hours. Emily stared at him, then yawned, blinking her eyes a few times and wiping away a tear. "I'm so sleepy already," she said. "Go to bed." Then John told her. "I want to wait for you," Emily said, resting her blonde head on his shoulder. At last they went to bed, and Emily complained to her husband again about her dizziness, then fell asleep. John, on the other hand, couldn't sleep for a long time. The next day, when he was at work, Emily called him and told him that she had been taken to the hospital. He jumped out of his chair in surprise. "What happened?" "Are you all right?" he asked. "I don't know. I passed out in the cafe and woke up in the hospital," Emily explained. "Honey, I'm on my way right now," John said, and leaving all his work and ordering his secretary to write down everything important, he went straight to the hospital. That day, Emily decided to meet an old friend at a cafe. Everything was fine at first. They were talking nicely, sharing things with each other. But at one point, Emily suddenly felt short of breath. She decided to get up to ask the waiter to turn on the air conditioner. But as soon as she did, her legs gave out and she collapsed to the floor. Her friend rushed to her, and the cafe staff called an ambulance. John paced the hallway in boredom. A nurse ran into him. "Calm down, man," answered him a girl whose low voice did not match her fragile appearance. "Your wife is fine. Ward 5. Come in, please," the nurse said, pointing to the door with her right hand. John literally flew in. Emily was lying there, covered by a sheet. When John saw her, he rushed to her bedside, knelt down, and took her palm in his hands. "Emily, my sweet love, how glad I am that you are well. When you called me, I was so frightened," said the husband, covering his wife's palms with kisses, pressing against her chest, looking into her eyes. "It's all over now. My good man, everything is over," she said, and closed her eyes. Tears came to her eyes. "Why are you crying?" John asked her. "I lost the baby," Emily whispered. She squeezed her eyes shut even tighter, trying to hold back the tears, but she couldn't and burst into tears. "What are you talking about?" John said, not believing his ears. He soothed his wife, stroking her shoulders and back. 5 days later, Emily was discharged home. The doctor recommended regular vitamin intake as well as scheduled IVs to keep her healthy. He also asked for bed rest and no excessive stress on the body. Emily was a little upset about her condition and the fact that she had to lead a sedentary lifestyle. Despite this, she took regular walks in the park and tried to be outdoors more. Sometimes, when John had a free moment, he would join her. Together they strolled leisurely along the narrow paths, admiring the perfect lawn and the view of the waterfront. Suddenly, John happened to see Ashley on his left. He was very happy to see her, but had to restrain himself in his wife's presence so as not to give himself away. He motioned for Emily to take a seat on the bench. The wife felt devastated. She realized that she needed to draw a resource from somewhere, to take strength to continue living life to the fullest. But the memory of the loss of her child each time brought her down into an abyss of sadness and melancholy. She understood that she had to be in the mood, she had to please her husband, but she just didn't have the strength to do it, and she didn't know where to get it from. Silently, she stared at her feet in her blue shoes, occasionally shifting her blank stare to passers-by. Meanwhile, John glanced discreetly to her left. There, behind a large tree trunk, she could be seen. Ashley was talking to a young man John didn't know. They were talking and laughing about something. And John suddenly felt an incipient jealousy building inside him. Why would he do that? And why would he do that? He has a wife. He loves her. What a man of property. Emily was silent, and John was silent. And he kept glancing over at Ashley. He secretly hoped she'd see him. It had been so long since they'd last seen each other. Then John's thoughts turned to Michael. How's he doing? I'd have to ask Ashley about that, he thought. Who's that? Ashley, Emily suddenly asked him. John pretended as if he didn't understand where she'd seen her or who she was talking about. It's not Ashley. You must be imagining it, John said for some reason. But Emily persisted and soon called Ashley's name. She turned around and waved at them with a big smile. Come here, Emily shouted to her. John, whose memory of kissing her was still fresh in his mind, got a little nervous, froze on the bench, and began to adjust his shirt. Ashley stepped closer to them, and Emily greeted her. Strangely enough, she acted perfectly calm, as if there was nothing between her and John at all. The man even thought for a moment that he might have been taking something too seriously that wasn't really worth worrying about at all. How are you doing? Tell me, how's Michael? Emily asked. Ashley was eager to talk about what was going on, about her life. Michael is doing well. He's learning. He's getting new knowledge. He likes everything. He promised to send me a picture, but he can't send it. He says he has no time, she said through laughter. Well done, boy. It's always been his dream, said Emily. I'm happy for him, too, Ashley said. Then she turned her gaze to John and looked him straight in the eye. He felt like she was seducing him right now with her pretty face. He felt his cheeks begin to burn, and he glanced furtively at Emily's wife. He tried to see if she suspected anything, but all his fears were in vain. Emily had her full attention on Ashley, who was a breath of fresh air to her. Yes, she lacked female companionship, and she needed the support of a woman. She even suggested to Ashley that they get together sometime to sit in a cafe. She said she'd be glad to, but she'd have to pick a free day. They talked for a while, and then Ashley said she had to go. John and Emily headed home as well. Evening had fallen. A cool air was descending on the town. It was pleasantly soothing and drowsy, making them want to go home and crawl under the warm blankets. That night, John couldn't sleep again. Thoughts of this girl, who was much braver than he had thought, would not leave him. The next day, when his workday was over and he was heading to his car, he heard a familiar hello. John stopped, looked in the direction the voice had come from, and was pleasantly surprised. But it really was Ashley in front of him. She was standing, leaning against her car. She was, as she always was, in a frilly pantsuit, slacks, and a blazer with a low-cut tank top underneath. She looked stylish and eye-catching. John looked around to make sure no one could see him. Then he slowly approached the girl, stood in front of her, and looked at her sharp chin, which she lifted up at that moment, presenting her thin, smooth neck to him. John was ready to put his lips to her soft skin right now, but he held himself back on purpose, realizing that it wasn't the right thing to do. "Should I give you a ride?" she asked, knowing the answer in advance. "I'd be willing to go to the end of the world with a nice driver," John answered her. The scent of her perfume reached his nostrils, and he reached for it. He almost touched her cheek, but Ashley dodged him. "Jump in the car, baby," she said rather defiantly. It made her future traveling companion even more excited. John was fully aware that his beloved wife was waiting for him at home. But he was drawn to this woman like a magnet. He literally couldn't help himself. She was truly full of life, full of passion and feelings that make us live and feel that we are alive. John didn't want to think about anything else that day. He wanted to savor the moment. He and Ashley went to the waterfront, where they spent a pleasant evening. The weather was surprisingly warm. It was wonderful to be outdoors. Ashley was having fun, laughing. Her laughter sounded so resonant, and it made John feel different from Emily, who had been feeling more and more depressed and sad lately. She took off her shoes and began to stroll down to the shore, each time gracefully drawing a line with her foot. John walked a little farther along, admiring her dance steps. Then she threw off her jacket, exposing her beautiful shoulders, and began to move them so sweetly and tantalizingly, as if she were deliberately teasing John. Finally, their walk ended, and they both ended up at the apartment where she lived with Michael. As soon as they entered, John pounced on Ashley and pinned her against the wall, running his fingers down her neck, traveling lower. Ashley waited for him to make the first move. The feelings overwhelmed them both. Trying to stop was futile. There seemed to be nothing better than the present moment. John was happy to drown in this passion, in these emotions, to inhale the scent of her skin, her hair, to touch her body and feel himself the happiest man in the world. After this encounter, filled with madness, John could no longer live as before. He began to look at his once beloved wife in a completely different way. She made breakfast and put it on the table. Emily refused to eat breakfast, citing a lack of appetite and a headache. If John had known how to help her, he would have done so. but the only thing he could do was to get his wife to see another doctor, who would get her back on her feet in no time, and they would forget about the constant apathy and lack of energy. That afternoon, John ate breakfast alone. Emily poured tea into a mug and went to her room. Her husband ate breakfast alone, but strangely enough, that's what he wanted now, to be alone with the memories of the woman who had colored his last night. After breakfast, John asked if Emily needed anything. "No, dear, thank you. I have everything." "You don't have to worry," she replied as she turned another page of the book she had spent most of her life in. The next time John met with Ashley, he unwittingly told her about what was going on in his family. She caught his pensive look and asked what was wrong. John replied that he was concerned about his wife's condition. "Yes, I've noticed too that Emily is a bit immersed in herself." "Is something troubling her?" Ashley asked so thoughtfully. Her voice was calm and gentle, and John decided to tell her everything. Ashley listened to him carefully and then said, "Yes, it's hard to live with a depressed person. Not only does he himself not know how to deal with it, he also surrounds his loved ones with the same mood." John said he himself began to feel a lack of desire to do anything. "I used to always be in a good mood, going to work, trying to do something for the family, to earn more, to fulfill the plan, or to get home faster. But now it's like I'm losing the point of it. I feel like Emily and I have become very distant from each other. So what? She's not interested in me anymore. I feel like I can't help her. The only thing I can do is find a good doctor to get her out of this state of perpetual apathy and depression." Ashley was smoking a cigarette at this time. John was sitting on the edge of the bed, his legs covered by the blanket. Ashley lowered herself to the floor and held out the cigarette to him. Emily took a deep drag on the cigarette. You could hear the tobacco crackling as it burned. "You know, I have a good doctor," Ashley said in a confident voice. "He pulled my best friend out of a similar condition once. He knows what he's talking about." Her confident tone cheered John up a little. He even felt a little relieved at the thought of being able to help Emily. "I'll talk to him, and then I'll let you know when you and Emily can come see him," the brunette said, and took another drag on her cigarette. John looked at Ashley and envied his brother a little, because he had gotten the girl. When the husband got home, he talked to his wife about the new doctor. "He's been praised and recommended," he said. Emily sat on a kitchen chair. John stood behind her, telling her about the doctor and the treatment that was sure to help her. He massaged her neck and shoulders with his large, warm hands. After some thought, Emily agreed. She too wanted to return to a full life and improve her health. At the doctor's appointment, the middle-aged man asked a few questions. "Tell me, how long have you been having negative thoughts?" he asked. Emily sat in the chair, looking around the walls of the office, her gaze resting on a shelf of books. The office was spacious and bright. On William's doctor's desk were a row of elephant figurines, all with their trunks up. Emily counted 9 elephants, all of them different. "Why elephants?" Emily asked instead of answering. That confused the doctor a little. "Well, elephants bring happiness," was the first thing that came to his mind. After a moment's hesitation, he said, "Let us return to the subject of our conversation. I need to understand your condition so that I can give you the right treatment." Emily exhaled and began to tell him about the first signs of her ailment. The doctor listened attentively, making notes in his notebook. Emily watched him as she continued her story. William finally drew some conclusions for himself and then invited John into his office. He explained to both of them what tests needed to be taken. Emily felt overwhelmed. When she and her husband stepped out into the hallway, she turned to him. "Honey, I don't think we should do this. My doctor is doing fine. He knows me well." She was used to her doctor and didn't want to work with a new person. But her husband insisted, saying it would be for her own good. After some hesitation, she agreed. John put his arm around her shoulders, pulling her close to him. She smiled back at him and reached up to kiss him. John was very glad that they did see a doctor and his wife agreed to be treated by another specialist. When the test results came back, John visited the doctor's office again, and the doctor gave him the medication that Emily was to take on a specific schedule. "Tell me, when can we expect to see improvement?" John asked. The doctor answered ambiguously and vaguely, saying that every body was different and it would take time to know how fast the healing process would take place. John shook the doctor's hand, thanking him, and walked out the door. Emily greeted him with a smile. When he got home, she stood wrapped in blankets. She had spent the whole day in bed. "You can put the kettle on and sit down at the table. I ordered your favorite sushi," your husband said in an upbeat mood. "Oh, by the way, I went to the doctor today. He handed over your medication." Emily walked lazily into the kitchen. She had a bit of a headache. "Of course, since you've been in bed all day. Tomorrow your new treatment will begin. I'm sure it'll work out this time, honey," John said as he came out of the bathroom. Emily tried to stay in a good mood, even though she had been experiencing a lingering dull ache in her abdomen since morning. She decided not to tell her husband about it, so that she wouldn't upset him and start whining about her aches and pains. She sat down at the table. Soft, voluminous blanket enveloped the girl like a dense foam. She looked very cute in that outfit. Open-shouldered outfits suited her perfectly. Oh my gosh. Emily used to be cheerful, joyful, always full of life. John remembered the first time they'd met, when Emily had looked so confused, so defenseless, and that made her even more attractive. But now, when John looked at his wife, he didn't recognize her at all. The once cheerful person had turned into a creature with sad eyes that was impossible to look at without pity. John picked up one roll with his chopsticks and held it out to Emily. She laughed, but ate it. Their modest family dinner passed in silence, and then they went to bed. John thought about Ashley. It would be nice to meet her. How is she doing now? Michael should be here soon. Something's holding her up. Maybe it's for the best. John looked at his wife. She was lying on her back with her head turned to the left, sleeping soundly. John ran his hand over her shoulder, then turned to his right side and fell asleep. It wasn't long after Emily had started her new treatment. But strangely enough, she only got worse. She reported it to her husband. He was upset. They put his wife in the hospital. "I'm so worried that something might happen to her," John said when he met up with Ashley again. He was standing by the window. Ashley stepped closer, ran her palm along the line of his jacket, shook off the non-existent dust, and stared directly at his lips. "Understand you're doing everything you can to help your wife. It's not like you can jump over your head. No one can. It's impossible," she said in a gentle, clear voice. "So stop torturing yourself in vain and let yourself rest after all." She looked into John's eyes, and he believed her, pressed his lips to hers, felt the tenderness of her lips, and sank as if in weightlessness. Ashley pulled off his jacket and slowly began to undo the buttons of his shirt. "You need to relax, trust me," she whispered. It seemed to John that Ashley was right, and there was nothing wrong with him spending another night with her. After all, Ashley had helped him, supported him through everything, even found his wife's doctor. And John liked her as a woman. He couldn't stop her embrace, and he didn't want to. He wrapped his arms around her thighs, squeezed them tightly. Soon he didn't notice how he fell in love with this girl. He kept thinking about his brother, who was still abroad and didn't seem to be in any hurry to return. But John was only too glad for that. As long as Michael was in Germany, he could still go out with Ashley. One morning the man was getting ready for work. He was already running a little late, hurriedly tying his tie as he went. He'd had a little coffee, almost burned himself. Lately he'd been making his own breakfast, since Emily was still in bed indulging in sleep. John entered the room to say goodbye to her before leaving for work. But when he entered, he found his wife lying on the bed. Her right arm was down on the floor. She was lying in a rather unfamiliar position. Suddenly, John was overcome with panic. He was afraid that perhaps Emily wasn't well. And he was right. He ran over to her and checked her pulse first, slapping her cheeks, trying to bring her to her senses. John's whole body shook with fear. He rushed to the phone and dialed Ashley's number. "Stop being hysterical," she said in a voice that had a distinctly steely edge to it. "If she has a pulse, she's alive. I'll call an ambulance to take her back to the hospital. Calm down. I'm coming to you," she said, and then hung up. Ashley's eyes flashed with an evil light. She arrived at John's house very quickly indeed. The ambulance arrived at the same time. Emily was placed on a stretcher and taken to the hospital. Ashley walked over to John and looked into his eyes. "You don't have to be afraid of anything. It's going to be okay," she said so insistently and so confidently, wrapping her arms around John's face. There was fear in his eyes. "The doctors are doing everything they can." "I love you," the brunette added so suddenly that John didn't even know what to say to her. He was grateful to this girl for being there for him and helping him in every way possible. His breathing became more rapid. He was also staring into Ashley's gray eyes, which were literally penetrating him. "I love you, too," he said. Ashley's expression became emotional. Tears welled up in her eyes. Her lips stretched into a smile, and her whole face lit up with a strange light, completely baffling John. It was as if he didn't realize what he just said, or how his words had affected Ashley. She nestled her lips against his again. She did it as if they were the only two people in the world. "Let's go to the hospital and check in, and then we'll go to my place," she said. John agreed with her. They arrived at the hospital and asked the doctor about Emily's condition. They received a disappointing answer. William George said that Emily's illness had taken on a new form, and her condition had become more complicated. John wrapped his arms around his head. He didn't want to believe what the doctor was telling him. He was depressed. Words could not describe how he felt right now. John got up from his seat, walked out into the hallway, and began to walk from side to side, biting his fist. He did not want to accept the current state of affairs, because the treatment proposed by the doctor was supposed to improve his wife's condition. But in the end, the opposite had happened. And John felt guilty. He had insisted that Emily try the new treatment. Maybe he should have left things as they were, and none of this would be happening now. He berated himself for the mistake he'd made. His head throbbed as if someone inside it was trying to push the walls apart, pushing them harder and harder time after time. But Ashley came out into the hallway, joining him, wanting to hug him, but he wasn't ready for that right now. "I understand how you feel, but we don't have to give up," she said. Her words only made John feel worse. Ashley told him that the best thing to do now was to go home and get a good night's sleep. "There's not much you can do for your wife in your condition," Ashley pointed out. John listened to her again, and they drove to her house. "I neglected her. I betrayed her," the man said, sinking into guilt. "I shouldn't have done it. There's nothing I can do now. What a fool I am. What an idiot. She really loves me. She's faithful to me. And I left her in this state," John said, sitting back in his chair. The top 2 buttons of his dark blue shirt were undone. He was rubbing his chin and cheeks, which were covered with fine stubble. "What about me?" Ashley asked suddenly. "Don't my feelings for you count? My sincere love for you? Do you think that's just a bunch of empty words? How am I supposed to live with that?" She sank to the floor in front of him. John distracted himself from his self-destructive thoughts and looked at her. "You haven't thought about me at all, because I love you too. What am I supposed to do about it?" she asked him, her gaze demanding. Then she grabbed his hands and began to cover them with small kisses. Are you going to leave me now? Will you leave me? Forget me? Ashley asked jokingly, looking into his eyes. Ashley's eyes were desperate and bewildered. John took her hands in his. Wait, that's not what I was going to say at all, he said, fearing to see the distress on Ashley's face. But that's exactly what you're saying. You're saying you love your wife and regret getting involved with me. You're willing to abandon me when I need your support the most. God, how am I supposed to get through this? Having said that, Ashley tried to go upstairs, but John held her back. What are you talking about? He interjected. His emotions went from self-recrimination to Ashley's depressed state. Michael, she said barely audibly, putting a hand to her lips. What's wrong with him? John interjected with a frown. I was going to tell you later, but what does it matter now? I got a call from the emergency services yesterday that Michael was missing, she said, turning toward the window. John lit a cigarette, probably trying to calm himself down. He too rose from his chair and hesitantly wanted to approach her, but stopped halfway. Wait, but how did this happen? I mean, you said he was fine, and you talked on the phone regularly. He looked at her slender figure, clad in the black lace cardigan that suited her so well. Yes, that's right. We've talked often, but there's been no messages from him in the last few days. I got worried, but I had no contacts to find out what was wrong with him. So I called the search service, through their channels. They found out that a certain Michael Alexandrovich had disappeared without a trace. That sounds strange. Where could he have disappeared to? John asked. Ashley, standing with her back to him and looking at her reflection in the window, took a deep drag on her cigarette smoke. It's awful, she said in a shaky voice ready to turn to crying. John came over and put his arm around her. But why didn't you tell me about it right away? The more time passes, the harder it is to find a person. He waited for a response. Ashley took her time answering. She smoked quietly, put out her cigarette, then turned to John. I had too much on my plate at one point. I wasn't just thinking about myself, I was thinking about how to help his wife. I tried to handle it on my own, especially since you have your own worries. Your wife needs help, too. You didn't immediately hire a good doctor for her, did you? Her voice took on a steely tone. It slightly confused and stunned John. He didn't understand what Ashley was getting at. You know, I've been doing everything I can to make my wife better. But God knows, things took a different turn. John began to make excuses. Ashley decided to stop talking this time. Walking over to him, she put her arms around him. You're all I have left, she said. John was overcome with guilt again. He realized that he had no right to leave Ashley alone right now. They spent that night together, comforting each other. The next day, after waiting for John to leave for work, Ashley went to run some errands. Before going out, she took a bath and picked out her clothes. She put on a beige suit, which looked stylish and not too revealing, and completed the look with earrings, a chain, and her favorite perfume. After assessing her reflection in the mirror, she left the apartment. Ashley knew exactly where she was going. Her cab stopped outside the hospital. She walked confidently toward the main entrance. Ashley didn't come here to see Emily. Almost at the end of the hallway, she turned right and opened a door with a sign that read Chief Medical Officer William George. Oh, you, my dear. It's good to see you, he said, rising from his chair. It seemed he and Ashley had been acquainted for a long time and knew each other quite well. They exchanged welcoming kisses. You look lovely, as always, the doctor commented on his guest's appearance. I came to tell you that it's time for us to speed up the process. Don't you think so? She asked the doctor. He spat in his chair, put his foot on his leg, and put his hands on the armrests. Definitely felt like a king. Yeah, what do you suggest? William George said playfully, taking out 2 small glasses and a bottle of white wine from the minibar. He poured just a little into the glasses and held one out to Ashley. Let's at least drink to our meeting. It's so rare to see you anymore. I miss these moments, he said. Ashley looked at him and took a deep breath without answering. She remembered how he'd picked her up on the street when she was very young, given her shelter and food. Never tried to keep her close to him, but Ashley realized herself that she needed to stay close to him now. And only when she felt her own strength, expressed her desire to live independently and separately from him, she rented her own apartment and began to live again. Except she didn't know how to live any other way. Thanks to William George, she learned to seduce men, to fall in love with them, and then, having obtained the desired result, to part with them coldly and ruthlessly. The worst of it was that this man could give her everything but true love. Ashley, who had lived with him for 4 years, could not get rid of her consumerist attitude toward men. And now that she was on her own, she'd met them time after time and used them. They were all different, each good in his own way, young, interesting, promising just the kind of men this girl needed. She got to know them, fell in love with them, took what interested her, and then parted. This went on countless times, and there was no way this girl could stop. She did not know how to live differently, because she knew how to behave with the opposite sex only like this. Unfortunately, she was too uptight and closed to be real to them, and so she was only able to communicate with them superficially for her own benefit. Ashley was far from stupid and had caught herself thinking that more than once. But she was unable to change her behavior. It was more difficult than she had imagined. But despite this, there was always one person in her life to whom she could return at any moment, from whom she could ask for help, and who could take pity on her. That was William George, and this time she had come to ask for his help again. She needed to speed things up, for she could not wait long enough to avoid arousing unnecessary suspicion. "I need your help again," Ashley said, clutching the thin-stemmed glass in her hand. "What are you talking about?" The doctor asked her again. "You know what I mean," she replied. "You must remember that I am always ready to help you, because you are like a daughter to me," he said. He walked around the table, sat down on the countertop, and then, facing Ashley at a very close distance, allowed himself to cup her chin. This man loved to feel power over others, and especially this girl. William reached forward, wanting to touch her lips. "Give me what I ask of you first," Ashley replied, pulling his hand away. He looked at her for a moment, then stood up, walked over to the safe, opened it with a small key, and took out a tiny bottle. "Here you go, and don't forget your precautions," he said, sitting down on the edge of the table again and folding his hands on his knee. It was like he was waiting for Ashley to go a little softer on him, but she kept her distance. And they both felt it. When Ashley got home that evening, John was already here, having made them both a light dinner, and was glad to have Ashley to keep him company. She asked how his day at work had gone. John replied that things were holding steady. When both of them had satisfied their hunger, they were still in the kitchen talking about their various chores. "I brought some medicine. You should give it to Emily," she mumbled, immediately handing John a small vial. "What is it?" he asked. "Believe me, the glass contains something that will help your wife," Ashley said. "Where did you get it?" he asked again. "Money. It's not that important anymore. What's important is that we have something we can do for your wife," she said, not wanting to go into details. Ashley's words always had a surprising effect on John. Maybe it was the effect of falling in love. The day John had come to visit Emily, he'd done everything Ashley had told him to do. He piously believed that Ashley wished nothing but the best for him and his family. Pouring water into a glass, he opened the vial and poured its contents into the water. Emily's appearance left a lot to be desired. She was pale, her cheeks sunken. When she saw John, she tried to smile. Her lips were pale, chapped. "Emily, you need to drink this," John said. "The doctor said it would help you keep your body strong." "Thank you for your concern," she said in a weak voice. Her husband helped her up so she could take the medicine. Emily emptied the glass and looked into her husband's eyes again. She was sorry he had to see her in this condition. "Don't worry, I'll get better soon, and everything will be fine," she said. John ran his palm over her cheek. He was looking at his wife as if she were a different person now. "You're going to be all right," he said. Even though he said so, he could hardly believe it. For too long the doctors had been trying to cure her. But all their efforts were in vain. The disease had no intention of leaving its new home. Yes, John had lied. But what else could he tell her in this situation? A few days later, Emily got worse. The doctors were very tight-lipped, and one day they informed John that they had to transfer Emily to a hospice unit. He was shocked by the news. As always, Ashley was by his side, putting her hand on his shoulder. Both of them returned home. John was heartbroken. He didn't want his wife to end her life by passing away in the prime of life from some unknown disease. Ashley found something to say to him again. She talked and told him not to blame himself for anything, that he shouldn't forget about himself and his life as it was. "You are young, you are handsome, you are full of vigor. You can't put an end to your life," she said. John sat on the couch, putting his elbows on his knees and covering his face with his palms. "You don't have to put your hands down. You're not alone. You know you have me," she said, spreading his arms. Ashley climbed into his lap, wrapped her arms around his face, and looked into his eyes. "You don't have to give up. Do you hear me? And I'll always be there for you," she said, and then nestled her lips against his. How did she do it? It remains a mystery, but as time went on, Emily stayed in the hospice. There she received the care she needed, no longer hoping for her recovery. Meanwhile, Ashley moved in with John. She was already feeling like a full-fledged mistress and was thinking about what kind of renovations she wanted to make to her room and telling John what kind of kitchen she wanted to replace her old one. He saw Ashley's happy eyes, and it seemed to him that this was the way it should be. Soon she started talking about getting married. More and more changes were happening in John's life. He couldn't figure out if he was going in the right direction. Ashley, on the other hand, was persistent. Unlike him, she knew exactly what she wanted. Once, while John was watching TV on the couch, she sat next to him and stroked his hands. John responded by stroking her hands. Finally, when Ashley had his attention, she said, looking at the ring finger of her hand, "How nice an engagement ring would look here. Don't you think so?" she asked, looking at John. "Yes, any jewelry would look lovely on your beautiful, delicate hands," John pointed out. "No, you don't understand. I want a wedding band," Ashley said flatly. "Are you serious?" John clarified. "What do you think? You and I have been living together under the same roof for so long, and you still wonder if we're serious about each other?" Ashley asked him. "Well, yeah, I agree with you, you're right. But how can we get married when my wife thinks I'm still in love with her?" John suddenly objected. Ashley looked at him reproachfully. "How can you say that? Look, you're not only hurting your feelings right now, you're hurting mine too. I'm living with you. I'm hoping for something, making plans, dreaming about our children. Life goes on. I'm not getting any younger. Are you ready to wait and stall for time? You've upset me too." "I didn't expect this from you," Ashley said. "I was sure that you really loved me and that you were ready to start a family with me. But then all of our meetings and hugs and kisses weren't real. Was it?" At that question, Ashley jumped to her feet and looked at John as if he'd just betrayed her. "I guess you're saying that you never loved me, and everything that happened between us was just a lie, a pathetic game you made up. Tell me the truth," Ashley screamed. "Are you really crazy?" "No, Not at all, John said, trying to even things out. Why would you think that? Calm down, please. I'm not with you for a game, believe me, really. I really like you. I have feelings for you. And of course, I'd like to marry you. Oh, for God's sake. Marry me. John suddenly said, getting down on one knee and taking out the ring he wanted to give her for her birthday. I'm sorry I wanted to do this a little later, but I'm very happy that you're going to be my wife. I really am, he said, and in that moment he was probably sincere. After all, he wasn't going to hurt Ashley, and he was ready to take her as his wife. Oh my God, John, this is so sudden, she suddenly exclaimed, delighted. She put her hands to her mouth like a child, as if she were afraid to frighten away the sudden happiness. What joy. I'm so happy. At last we will be able to legalize our relationship and not hide, she said. Soon they signed and celebrated this festive celebration in a cafe with friends. Ashley was glowing with happiness. The guests congratulated the newlyweds. John felt a little awkward, but still, hearing the approving congratulations of the guests, was happy about it. John, you're doing great. Congratulations. How is Emily? One of his friends asked him. He replied that everything was the same with her. The groom tried to avoid these questions. After the celebration, family life settled down to a moderate pace. John was still working, visiting Emily in hospice on his free days. She rarely spoke to him and slept more and more. John, when visiting her, could not tell her that he had remarried. Before entering the room, he took off his wedding ring, which was wide and different from the ring Emily had once put on his finger. To be honest, John sighed with relief when he saw Emily asleep. In front of her, he felt a kind of shame for what he'd done. But now he was back home. Today was a day off, and Ashley was looking forward to seeing John. She had a surprise for him, and when he sat down at the table, she pulled out a small box. John looked at everything going on with interest in his eyes. Well, don't you want to open it? She uttered, looking intently into his eyes. He smiled and replied that of course he wanted to. He took off the top pink cardboard lid and saw a beige napkin inside, on which was a soft bear cub the size of a small ball, and next to it a smooth paper strip. What is it? John wondered. He grinned and looked at Ashley again. You and I are having a baby, she said, and stepped a little closer to John, taking his hands in hers and placing them on his lower abdomen. Can you feel that our baby is here? She bared her white teeth. John could hardly believe it. But it was true, and he would soon be a father. God, this was what he had dreamed of for so long. With Emily, they'd tried to have kids, but it hadn't worked out. But with Ashley, it was different. He was about to become a father. Ashley walked down the hallway past John's office. It was a small cubbyhole where he used to crawl in alone, thinking about something or talking on the phone. The door was ajar, and Ashley saw him. He was sitting at the table. He had a rather pensive look on his face. His eyes were staring straight ahead. John was definitely not here right now. He held a glass of whiskey in his left hand, squeezed the right corner of his mouth, then emptied the glass. John was distracted from his heavy musings by Ashley, who had just entered the office. Catching her husband's gaze, she smiled. He pulled a smile onto his face as well. He didn't want her to see him sad for anyone. And he had someone to be sad about. He thought of Emily, of leaving her, of stopping fighting with her, and it made him feel hard. Honey, could you give me a few minutes? Ashley spoke. She was holding some paperwork. I had a checkup at the doctor's office. We want the baby to be born healthy, right? She fixed John's hair. Of course, my love, her husband answered her, closing his eyes. You know, I put your name as my proxy. Sign here, please. She whispered in a soft voice. John, without a second thought, took the pen and, without reading anything, signed his name in the lower right-hand corner. "Thank you, my good man." Ashley leaned over to kiss him. "Are you going to bed, or are you going to stay here a while?" she asked, tucking the papers behind her back. He replied that he would stay a little longer and he would join her in bed. "I'm waiting for you," the mother to be added, and left for her room. Ashley put the papers in her bag, then undressed and lay in bed. Her eyes were open. She wasn't going to sleep. She waited for John to come in, but he was in no hurry. He poured the whiskey again, emptied the glass again. He was not feeling well, to say the least. It would seem a happy new wife, a child in the future. But no peace of mind. And he knew it very well himself. He thought about his ex-wife and how she had stopped recognizing him. She'd gotten really bad. John tried to think about the present, about what he had now, but his thoughts kept coming back to Emily. While he was enjoying his new family life, she was slowly fading away, day by day. The next morning, a young doctor entered Emily's room. He was taller than average, had blonde hair and an equally blonde, close-cropped beard. He had started working at the hospice only a week ago. Before that, he had worked in a neighboring town in a polyclinic. However, writing his doctoral thesis forced him to transfer to the hospice for necessary observations. This young doctor naturally had an inquisitive mind. Moreover, he was very quick and qualitative in this direction, from which he was quickly liked by the entire medical staff. The doctor carefully examined the patient, wrote something down in his notebook. His eyes were focused. He glanced again at the patient, whose face had a horrible hue. Vaguely, he recalled how they were taught what to do in cases like this. A line below it, he wrote down the tests he intended to take from this woman. I was about to leave when suddenly I heard a very soft voice. "Wait, stay with me for a while." Emily did not open her eyes, but she knew that someone was with her. She was already so weak that at times consciousness came back to her, and a great sadness and pain came over her at being here. It had been a very long time since she had seen John, but she didn't blame him for that. She realized that there was nothing he could do about her being so sick. It was only the sadness of that realization that filled her soul. "I'm here," the doctor answered. Emily struggled to open her eyes. It seemed to be the first time she had seen this face. "What is your name?" she asked. "My name is Michael George." "Michael to you," he said. "I'll need to run some new tests on you to see what's going on." "Go ahead, doctor, I don't care anymore." "I already know there's only one end," she said with difficulty. The doctor did not answer her. He understood that her condition was grave, but something was definitely confusing him. And the practice he had under his belt told him that this woman might have been misdiagnosed. But when he took all the necessary biomaterials and analyzed them, his hunch was confirmed, and he immediately started the treatment according to the new scheme. And one day when he came to visit Emily, she was already waiting for him. She was still lying in bed, unable to get up. Even so, her mind was clearer. "Good morning," she greeted the doctor. He answered her in the same way. His lips turned up in a smile. "You're in a good mood, I see," he asked as he came closer. As he had all the previous days, the doctor checked her pulse and blood pressure, felt her lymph nodes, and drew blood. Emily held his gaze. "How do I know?" "Your face is very familiar to me," she said suddenly. Michael looked intently into her eyes. "Yes, that's right. I've definitely seen you somewhere before," she said, "but I can't remember where." The long stay in oblivion had weakened her memory a little. "Unfortunately, I can't help you with that. Maybe when you're feeling a little better, you can solve this riddle," Michael replied casually. Suddenly the phrase, "you're asking the riddle," came to Emily's mind. It had been uttered then by the blonde-haired guy in the family circle. Emily's brain went through one picture after another. Things were getting a little confusing. She tried to focus. There were young people in front of her eyes, a blonde, a brunette, and some other man. That's right. There was her husband, John, and that young Dr. Michael. But how did he end up there with them? Tell me, do you have any family? Maybe brothers or sisters? I remember something, but I'm not sure, Emily said. Really? What is it? Michael grinned. Emily strained again to try to recreate the picture better. But alas. I have to admit, I'm the one who had the misfortune to lose his memory, Michael said. That left Emily stunned. What do you mean, lost your memory? She questioned. Michael wanted to tell her, but at that moment a nurse entered the room and called out to him. We'll talk about this later, okay? Michael said, distracted. Yes, of course, Emily said, smiling at him. The nurse who had called Michael looked at Emily strangely and closed the door without saying anything. The nurse told Michael to go to the head doctor's office. Michael knocked on the office, and after answering, he entered. Have a seat, Michael, said the chief physician. His name was Ben Anderson. Yesterday I wanted to ask about a patient named Emily Johnson. He looked at the doctor carefully. I must say, you've made great strides. And as cynical as it sounds, I'm glad you lost your memory once Ben laughed and prepared to listen to Michael's answer. Yes, sometimes we don't know where fate will take us, he answered. But what I'm wondering is, under what circumstances did this woman come to our hospice? Didn't the other doctors find the real cause of her illness? The strange thing is that the mobility of red blood cells, which had been reduced, became normal again, and the shape began to return to its original form. You, Ben, as a specialist with vast experience, you know that this occurs only in two cases. The first we immediately dismiss, and then we're left with the well-known clotting agent. But I don't understand your thinking, Ben Anderson interrupted him. Where are you going with this? Michael was in no hurry to answer. Something told him it was too early to say it out loud. Michael carefully monitored Emily and visited her every day. Despite the serious condition from which she had recovered and stabilized, she was still a person who loved life and had a kind heart toward people. Tell me, why doesn't anyone visit you? He once asked. When he said it, Michael regretted it. His words might have hurt her. She thought for a moment and replied that she didn't know why. I guess it's too hard for my husband to see me like this. Frankly, I've lost track of time. I can't tell you the last time he was here. Maybe a week ago, maybe a month. But I don't blame him. John was with me every day before I got here. He did everything he could to help me. I'm grateful for that. After all, if I hadn't gotten here, I wouldn't have met you, and my recovery wouldn't have begun. And yet your face looks familiar to me, she repeated, scrutinizing Michael. He squinted, as if trying to see something that had come to him. As you said, your husband's name is John? He asked, and seemed to sink further into the past, recognizing himself anew. She nodded, adding that John had a brother. After saying the last word, Emily fell silent. Finally, they looked into each other's faces. It seemed as if something important was about to be revealed. But the door to the room opened again, and Michael was urgently invited into the next room. Emily was left with the persistent feeling that she knew this man for sure and had seen him before. Eventually, she came to the conclusion that this young doctor just looked a lot like Michael, her husband's brother. Same blonde hair, and even his facial expressions were similar, but something was still different. And so far, Emily couldn't figure out exactly what it was that made her think that. On one hand, she seemed to be socializing with Michael, but on the other hand, looking at his face, he was very different from the Michael she had once known. Time went by and Emily was getting better and better each day. Emily could feel new strength literally being added to her. She could feel the blood in her veins developing throughout her body and filling it with warmth. She felt again that she could start doing something next time. When Michael came to see her, she asked him if he could purchase some thread and a hook for her. She had wanted to crochet a backpack for herself for a long time, but had put it off every time. Now she felt that she could crochet it in just a couple of days, and she wanted to make it happen. "Look, you're almost completely healthy," her doctor said. And it was true. She had even been moved to another ward because she no longer fit the parameters of a hopelessly ill person. "Don't you want to call your husband? After all, you are no longer without strength. You can talk to him about something," Michael suggested to her. But when he saw Emily's saddened look, he realized that it wasn't that simple. "I called him, but his phone was always out of range. I don't know what to think. Maybe he left town altogether," Emily said, a little confused. "Yeah, that's a little strange. How could a loving husband leave his wife in the hospital and not even be interested in her condition?" Michael asked the question aloud and regretted it again. He realized that this topic would hurt his ward. "Are you married?" Emily asked him in response. She again stumped him because the doctor could not remember the details of his personal life. That's how memory peculiarities work. Michael remembered the names of medications perfectly and was proficient in various therapies. But simple memories from everyday life could not be uncovered. And then Michael had an idea. He asked if Emily remembered the address of the house, and Emily clearly replied that yes, of course she did. Michael then suggested that they go to her house together so that she could visit her husband and find out why he had disappeared from her sight. Emily liked the idea very much. It came as a pleasant surprise to her, and that afternoon at lunchtime they drove to the address. The car slowly parked in the yard. Emily stepped outside and looked around the high-rise building. She was a little nervous because she couldn't know in advance what to expect. Michael got out of the car and offered to go up with her, but Emily declined, saying that she could handle it on her own. He agreed. Emily slowly began to climb up the stairs. Her heart raced with each step up the stairs. When she reached the familiar door with the two numbers 2 and 7 attached to it, she pressed the bell and was ushered in. She pressed the bell and licked her lips in anticipation. She mouthed to herself several times the words she would say to her husband when she met him. All those memories and the days she'd spent with John came vividly back to her mind. She held no grudge against him, but she wanted only one thing: to see him, to talk to him about everything. There was so much she wanted to tell him. She took a breath in and out and pressed the bell, then adjusted her collar and ran her hand through her hair a couple times. Finally, footsteps were heard outside the door, and the next moment the door opened. Instead of John's expected face, Emily saw before her the girl who had been present in her memories. Emily remembered that this was John's brother's girlfriend, so she smiled at her. "Hi, can I come in?" Emily asked, and her voice sounded unsure. The lady who'd opened the door for her wasn't exactly welcoming. She gave her a scornful look and, without saying a word, wanted to close the door in Emily's face. But she had the courage to hold on to the handle. "Ashley, I don't understand you. What's going on?" "I can't go into my own house?" she asked again. "What do you want here?" "This is already my apartment," the new landlady shocked Emily with her words. She grinned, asking if she was joking. After all, Emily hadn't gotten anything wrong. Emily was sure this was her apartment. "Liz, you must be confused about something. It's me, Emily, John's wife. And he's home right now. I need to talk to him." Saying that, she pushed Ashley away and entered the apartment. The latter realized that she would have to make an effort before this fool would realize that she was no one else here. Emily entered the apartment, looking in every room, wanting to find John, but he was nowhere to be found. "What's going on here? Where is John? What's wrong with him?" demandingly asked the guest. "And that's none of your business," Ashley replied rudely. She realized she wasn't going to get rid of her that easily. But the insolent lady had a trump card in her hand. Without a second thought, Ashley went to the closet, pulled out a file folder, threw it on the table, and unfolded it in front of Emily on the right page. Here, look, everything you wanted to know is printed in black letters in white. Read as much as you can. Saying this, she stepped back a little, crossing her arms over her chest. Emily began to cursorily study the documents with her eyes. The more she read each line, the more horrified she became by the minute. Her eyes rounded. She really didn't know what to say to that. "But how did this happen?" she asked, raising her eyes to Ashley. She silently held out her right hand in front of her. A ring sparkled on her ring finger. "That's not true. You're lying," Emily said in a raised voice, wishing it was all a lie. "I did call John, didn't I? His phone was off exactly the same as yours." Emily spoke the last words slowly, as if she'd just realized what was wrong. "Did you really set this whole thing up?" Emily questioned. But it was probably rhetorical. Ashley wasn't going to answer her at all. "I don't have to explain anything to you. Whatever you need, I've answered it. I've shown you the documents. Now, if you would be so kind as to leave my apartment." Ashley mumbled and walked to the door, opening it to get Emily out as quickly as possible. But as soon as she opened the door, she was immediately confronted by John. Her surprise took her breath away. She opened her mouth to say something, but nothing came to mind. But John, seeing his ex-wife behind her, who was standing on her own 2 feet and looking fine, was taken aback. "Emily," he said her name as if he hadn't expected it. Emily looked up at him and her eyes involuntarily began to fill with tears. John immediately took a few steps toward her, wanting to hug her, but Emily pulled back for some reason. "Emily, I'll explain everything to you. I was told you were transferred to another facility. I looked for you, but no one could figure out what I was asking of them. I can't believe it. You've recovered." He spoke the words. Emily listened to him, not knowing what to say back, as if it was too late to try to clarify anything now. "Oh God, Emily. Oh God, I'm so sorry," John was saying. Then suddenly he threw himself at her feet. Emily was completely confused. She didn't know what was happening. How could she be so abruptly left without everything? But at the same time, she couldn't see her husband, whom she still loved, suffer. "You weakling," Ashley pronounced. She did not recognize the manifestation of human feeling. She believed and was firmly convinced that it was merely a manifestation of weakness of character. Emily told John that she had tried to let him know about her health, but his phone had been off the whole time. John gave her a surprised look, because he was the one who had been calling Emily, and her phone was always busy. He immediately pulled it out and called his ex-wife again. As stated earlier, the answering machine answered. John then went into his phone settings and discovered that someone had blacklisted Emily's phone and had also set a call barring on that number. The first thing John did was turn to Ashley and gave her a questioning stare. She stood there with a nonchalant look. She masterfully kept her mask on, trying not to give herself away. "Okay, John, it doesn't make any sense now," Emily said. "You have a whole new life now, a new wife, a new family. You've even managed to sign the apartment over to her. I'm going to leave, no matter how much you cry here. It's all the same. John's long since fallen out of love with her and started a new life." "What are you talking about?" "I didn't rewrite anything to anyone," the man protested. Emily told him that the document said otherwise, and then asked Ashley to show him the new property certificate again. He didn't believe her, and when he saw the folder of documents in his current wife's hands, he asked to see them. "What a fool you are," she said, grinning. This surprised John even more, who had never seen Ashley in such a role before. "Here. You can watch as long as you want, can't you?" she said mockingly. John took the folder, found the necessary documents, and indeed found there a certificate that his apartment belonged to her. Next, he found another document with his signature on it. The man remembered the day when he was drunk and Ashley had approached him asking him to sign as a trustee. She had said at the time that it was being asked for at the women's health clinic. And then it hit John. It turns out there was no baby in question. And Ashley set this whole thing up just to get a new resource. "Why don't you tell me why you did it?" John asked her. His eyes were filled with horror and indignation. Ashley was starting to get angry. She didn't like being asked to justify herself. It had been a habit ever since she'd been living with William George. He always asked her to account for herself and often punished her severely. When she tried to lie to him, he was about to call the police to have them both thrown out the door. But at that very moment, the doorbell rang, and since the door was unlocked, the guests didn't wait for their hosts to arrive. Michael appeared on the doorstep, and he wasn't alone, he was with the police. Ashley realized there was no escape. How could it be? She miscalculated. She was sure that on the day Michael was supposed to take the plane to Germany, she had put a substance in his coffee in the morning that would cause spontaneity and fainting. She didn't spare the substance then and poured a lot of it in. Michael had breakfast, drank coffee, and only at the airport he began to feel unwell. He felt dizzy and began to see people who didn't exist. He felt nauseous and went to the toilet. That's where he lost consciousness. He was found only a few hours later. By that time, the plane had long since landed in another country, completely forgetting about the security guard. The police chose to keep silent about the fact that he remained alive. There have been many times crimes of this nature in the city, and the police decided to bring this case to the end and find the culprit, who every time acts according to the same scenario and always gets away with it. Michael remembered everything perfectly. He remembered Ashley, and that he had a brother John and a wife Emily. In order for him to work and not be too conspicuous, he was placed in hospice care where he met Emily. How hard it was for him to keep himself in check so he wouldn't give himself away. The police tried to work on his appearance to make it less recognizable. Special inserts on the movable eyelid and a false chin with a beard and mustache had done the trick. That's why Emily couldn't figure out who was standing in front of her. The police were careful not to spook Ashley. And when Emily and Michael went to her house, the police were already there. And there was nowhere for the perpetrator to go. Ashley was handcuffed and taken to the station. She was not going to be responsible for this alone, and that's why she told everything about William George. But he was more cunning and managed to escape abroad. John and Emily Johnson talked about a lot of things. They had a lot to discuss, found the strength to forgive each other and start living again. And as for Michael, he continued his work as a doctor, putting in his piggy bank of experience one more unique case.